Hey guys. Tonight we step into the velvet-draped nightmare of a woman who didn't live a fairy tale in the Middle Ages. She endured it every single day. The medieval queen. You've probably pictured her in movies or storybooks. Jeweled crown, silk gowns, strolling through marble halls with everyone bowing in awe. Yeah, no, the real story? She was crawling with lice under that crown, suffocating in 50 pounds of fabric, forced to smile at feasts while praying the rancid meat wouldn't kill her. This wasn't glamour. It was isolation, humiliation, and the constant threat of being replaced the moment she failed to give birth to a son. This is the brutal reality of being a medieval queen. And trust me, by the end of tonight, you'll never look at a crown the same way again. And hey, if you'd like to help keep the lanterns lit around here and support the deeply unsustainable caffeine addiction that fuels these midnight rabbit holes, there's a Buy Me a Coffee link pinned in the comments. No pressure at all, but every cup helps delay the caffeine-induced heart failure we all know is coming. But before you get too cozy, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this strange little corner of quiet storytelling. And drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's strangely comforting to know who else is drifting off with us around the world. Now get comfortable. Let the day melt away, and we'll drift back together into the quiet corners of the past. You sit on a carved oak throne, your crown glittering with jewels mined by peasants who will never breathe fresh air again. Courtiers bow low as you glide across polished stone floors, silk skirts whispering at your ankles. From the outside, it looks magnificent. From the inside, it feels like torture. The crown cuts sores into your scalp. Lice crawl under the velvet lining, feasting on your skin while you keep your chin high. The silk gown that dazzles foreign dignitaries hasn't been washed in months, and you sweat beneath it, itching as fleas hop across your bodice while the ambassador of France pretends not to notice. Your life is theater. The jewels, the feasts, the pomp. It is all staged. You smile at a banquet, while servants present trays piled with roasted swans and candied almonds. The smell is sweet, but the meat has been hanging for days, masked with cinnamon and cloves to cover the rot. You force down a bite, gambling with dysentery, praying you don't vomit in front of the bishop. And none of this food is for you anyway. It's propaganda. A show of abundance meant to convince the court your husband's treasury isn't one bad harvest away from collapse. Your power is as false as the feast. You don't rule. He does. At best, you are decoration, expected to nod, smile, and produce heirs. At worst, you are a hostage in a foreign land, married to a man who doesn't even like your accent. If you fail to give him sons, whispers spread like smoke, barren, cursed, sinful. Every miscarriage is a scandal. Every daughter is a disappointment. Your body is not yours. It is a machine for dynastic survival, and when it falters, the whole system turns on you. The castle doesn't save you. Those sparkling stone fortresses are freezing in winter, suffocating in summer. Your royal chambers stink of chamber pots emptied into the moat. The tapestries that impress visiting nobles exist not for beauty, but to block the drafts screaming through cracks in the walls. Rats scurry across the floors. The crown on your head does nothing to block the stench of human waste rising from below. Privacy is a fantasy. Every moment is public theater. You dress in the morning with ladies watching, some of whom report every word you say to the king. You eat in public. You pray in public. Even childbirth, the most terrifying moment of your life, takes place with witnesses pressed close. Because the kingdom demands proof the child came from your body. You lie on straw screaming, while half the court watches like it's entertainment. And yet the myths persist. Paintings polish the truth until only a smile remains. They show serene faces framed with pearls, never the abscessed gums behind those smiles, never the bruises on your arms from a husband who treats you as contract, not companion. They don't show the exhaustion of nights spent listening to his drunken laughter echo from his mistress's chamber. Queenship is not glory. It is survival. Every day you fight to keep your dignity in a system designed to strip it away. Men see you as property, clergy as temptation, nobles as a foreign intruder, peasants as a curse. You are not allowed to rage, not allowed to despair, not allowed even to speak the truth. One wrong word, one wrong look, and you are finished. The fairy tales lie because the truth is unbearable. A crown doesn't mean comfort, love, or safety. It means you are the centerpiece of a theater that smells of mold and blood, draped in jewels that cut into your temples, smiling through the knowledge that your life isn't your own. Storybooks show you sipping wine in candlelight. Reality forces you to drink weak ale to avoid parasites, to sit in a smoky hall where the fire chokes more than it warms, to scratch your scalp under a golden circlet full of vermin. The crown is heavy, yes, but heavier still is the truth. From the moment you were born into a noble household, your life wasn't yours anymore. Forget the idea of a carefree childhood full of games and freedom. From your very first cries, you weren't simply a daughter. You were an asset, a bargaining chip wrapped in swaddling cloth. Every smile you gave, every step you took, was already part of a plan designed by people who cared more about treaties and land than about your happiness. You were never just a child. You were a potential queen in the making, and that meant your future had been signed away before you could even walk. Your parents didn't raise you to dream. They raised you to serve a dynasty. While peasant girls ran barefoot through fields, you were kept inside stone halls learning to sit upright for hours without squirming. Your body wasn't really yours. It was a future contract. A marriage arranged before you were old enough to braid your own hair. Your father saw you as a way to strengthen his family's power. Your mother drilled into you the skills that would make you desirable in the cutthroat world of royal courts. You weren't allowed to be loud, to be curious, or to be ambitious unless it fit into the very narrow box carved out for a noblewoman. You existed to be pretty, pious, and pliant. Your education was less about expanding your mind and more about limiting it. You learned your letters, yes, but not to devour books or write your own thoughts. Literacy was a tool for prayers, for copying psalms, for memorizing the words of men holier than you would ever be. Mathematics? Only if it helped you manage a household budget someday. History? Only the sanitized version written to glorify kings and saints. Your lessons were carefully curated to make you obedient, never questioning. What mattered most was court etiquette, embroidery, and the art of silence. You learned to stitch endless flowers into linen while your brothers practiced swordplay in the yard. They were trained to lead armies. You were trained to keep your hands busy and your mouth shut. Religion wasn't just a subject. It was a leash. You were taught that obedience to God meant obedience to your father, your future husband, and the priests who oversaw both. You were reminded daily that Eve was to blame for the fall of man, and that as her descendant, your nature was weak, sinful, and dangerous if left unchecked. Your virginity wasn't simply a part of your body. It was your entire worth. The church hammered into you that chastity was your most valuable possession, not for yourself, but for the alliance it would someday cement. Every prayer you whispered was less about salvation and more about preparing you to accept a life of sacrifice without complaint. Meanwhile, your physical body was prepared like a commodity for the market. Your meals were carefully monitored to keep your figure delicate, but healthy enough to bear children. You were clothed in stiff gowns that forced your back straight, as though even your posture needed to be disciplined. If you stumbled, if you raised your voice, if you showed too much spirit, you were corrected, sometimes harshly. A queen couldn't afford to be clumsy or outspoken, and so the child in you was slowly smothered under layers of expectation until only the doll remained. You were taught how to dance just enough to be graceful at feasts, how to smile without showing too much teeth, how to lower your eyes at just the right angle to seem demure, but not weak. Your entire being was rehearsed like a role in a play. And all the while, the reality loomed over you like a storm cloud. Your future wasn't yours to choose. Marriages for noble girls were arranged when they were barely out of infancy. Sometimes you were promised away before you could speak in full sentences, a pawn in a deal that traded your body for peace between kingdoms or access to fertile land. You grew up knowing that one day a stranger would arrive, take your hand, and you'd be expected to smile as though it were a dream come true. In truth, it was nothing more than a polite transaction. Your opinions on the matter carried less weight than the feather quill used to sign the betrothal contract. Even the games of your childhood were rehearsals for the life you'd never control. While your brothers staged mock battles with wooden swords, you played at being brides and mothers. Dolls were your only safe outlet. Tiny cloth infants to rock and hush as practice for the real children you'd be expected to bear. Sometimes you might steal a moment of rebellion, running too far in the garden, blurting out a thought too bold. But you learned quickly that punishment followed. Your spirit was shaped, trimmed, and caged until it fit the mold of a queen who could smile and suffer in equal measure. And as you grew older, the whispers began. Your tutors commented on your beauty. Courtiers noted your promise. Priests reminded you that your duty was obedience. By the time you reached adolescence, your innocence had already been stripped away, not by scandal, but by the crushing awareness that you were never free. You might have looked at the peasants beyond the castle walls and envied them, even with their mud floors and empty bellies. At least they could marry for affection, however fleeting. At least they could run without worrying whether their gait was too unladylike. At least their futures belonged to themselves, however short and harsh those futures might be. The path laid out before you was straight and narrow: marriage, childbirth, survival. Perhaps, if fortune favored you, you'd outlive your husband and wield a fragment of real influence as a widow. But until then, you belong to others. First your father, then your husband, and always the court that judged your every move. From cradle to crown, your life wasn't about what you wanted. It was about what you represented. You were a symbol, a vessel, a piece in a game where kings moved the pieces and queens rarely survived to the end. So yes, you were groomed for power, dressed in jewels, taught to walk across marble floors with grace. But beneath the velvet and the silk, you had no power at all, only the illusion of it. And by the time you realized it, it was too late to escape. Being born into nobility didn't mean you were destined for love or even choice. It meant you were destined for the market, not the kind with stalls and vegetables, but the one where your worth was measured in acres of land, sacks of coin, and how useful your womb could be in tying two families together. You weren't seen as a daughter, a sister, or a girl with her own desires. You were a commodity, a dowry wrapped in velvet, waiting to be traded to the highest bidder who could keep your father's political ambitions intact. By the time you reached the age of 12, the word child no longer applied. Childhood was a luxury you weren't allowed to indulge in. Instead, you were evaluated like fine livestock. Were your hips wide enough to bear children? Did your complexion suggest fertility or frailty? Were your manners polished enough to impress an aging duke or a young king whose council only wanted heirs? Every movement you made, every word you spoke, was assessed for what it could add to your market value. A misplaced laugh or a poorly executed curtsy could become ammunition for whispers that you were unfit. You might be the one wearing silk ribbons in your hair, but you were never truly dressed for yourself. You were always dressed for inspection, and inspections came often. Suitors, envoys, matchmakers, and priests circled around you long before you understood the weight of their gazes. Conversations about your future happened in rooms you were not invited into, where men decided whether you would be shipped to France, Spain, or the next duchy over. The words betrothal contract carried more power than any protest you could voice. Families argued over dowry sums like farmers haggling over a mule. Was your father willing to part with enough gold, enough estates, enough troops to make your presence in another court worthwhile? The answer to that question, not your personal feelings, determined where you'd spend the rest of your life. And when the deal was struck, you were rarely older than 14, sometimes younger. You might have been playing with a spaniel in the courtyard one week and dressed in white silk the next. Your hair woven with pearls and a strange man standing beside you, smiling as though you were the prize hog at a county fair. Consent didn't exist in this world. It wasn't even a concept. You weren't asked if you wanted to marry. You were told. And once told, that was the end of it. Your new life was set, and the only choice you had left was whether to fake a smile convincingly enough to keep whispers of rebellion at bay. The weddings themselves were performances less about two souls uniting and more about two fortunes merging. Priests spoke of God's will, but everyone present knew it was politics. Your new husband could be 3 times your age, missing half his teeth, reeking of wine, or already father to illegitimate children. It didn't matter. What mattered was that he had land, an army, or a claim to a throne that your father found advantageous. You walked into the chapel as a child and walked out as a bargaining chip sealed into human flesh. And if you thought being married young meant you were spared the duties expected of adult queens, think again. From the moment vows were spoken, your body was no longer your own. You were expected to lie in bed with a stranger, often terrified and barely understanding what was happening, all under the unrelenting expectation of producing heirs. Failure to conceive quickly was considered not just personal disappointment, but political betrayal. Whispers grew, fingers pointed, and blame fell almost entirely on you. You weren't just a wife. You were a factory, and if the factory didn't produce, it was defective. Even when the marriage didn't officially begin until you were older, the shadow of it haunted your teenage years. Letters from your future husband's court arrived before you even knew how to flirt. Gifts were exchanged, portraits painted, alliances toasted. You became a public secret, spoken of as if you were already property belonging to another man, though you still slept in your father's house. Girls who once giggled beside you in the nursery now looked at you differently. You weren't a playmate anymore. You were spoken for, owned, untouchable. Not because of sacredness, but because of contract law. The irony was brutal. The songs and stories spun about queens promised romance, destiny, and gallant knights sweeping maidens off their feet. The reality was more like an auctioneer shouting numbers over a restless crowd. Those knights never showed up. Instead, you were paraded before ambassadors and noblemen who spoke of your virtue, as though they had already inspected it. You were always both too young and never young enough. Too inexperienced to have an opinion, but just old enough to be shipped away like cargo on the next political tide. And when you finally did leave, when the carriage rolled away from the only home you had ever known, there was no looking back. Your dowry had been delivered. You were your husband's problem now. If he ignored you, humiliated you, or took a mistress the day after the wedding, your family didn't care. They had gotten what they wanted. Land secured, borders safe, allies placated. Your feelings weren't even a footnote. You existed in the fine print, and the ink had already dried. To be a queen wasn't to be chosen. It was to be traded. You didn't marry for love. You married for security, for politics, for crowns that balanced precariously on bloody history. And every time you looked at the jewels glittering in your new crown, you knew they weren't symbols of your worth. They were reminders of the price your family had paid to sell you into a future you had no hand in choosing. That was the true cost of the marriage market, not the dowry of land or gold, but the dowry of your stolen life. Your wedding day, the one that's supposed to be the pinnacle of every fairy tale, wasn't a celebration of love or joy. It was a transaction, a spectacle designed to show off wealth, power, and political stability. From the moment you were dressed at dawn, you weren't a bride. You were a public display, a walking contract signed in fabric, jewels, and ritual. People will later remember the feast, the music, and the alliances confirmed, but no one will remember that you could barely breathe under the weight of the gown meant to make you shine. That gown, the one described in court poetry as shimmering like moonlight, was in truth a contraption of sweat and suffering. Stiff brocade, heavy velvet, endless embroidery stitched by the tired hands of peasants who had worked for months to finish it. Pearls sewn in by the dozens pulled at the fabric until it felt like you were wearing chainmail, not silk. The dress might have looked ethereal in candlelight, but wearing it was an ordeal. Every step dragged at your shoulders, every layer tightened your lungs. Beneath the gown, you wore linen shifts clinging with heat, your body already sore before the first bell rang. And still, you were expected to glide down the aisle with the serenity of a saint, not with the grimace of someone being suffocated by their own wardrobe. The veil was no relief either. It wasn't a light wisp of lace floating gracefully across your face. It was thick, suffocating, often woven with gold thread, stiff enough to itch and heavy enough to press down like a curtain across your skull. Some were so long they required attendants to carry the train behind you. The entire purpose was not your comfort, but your concealment. You were to arrive at the altar veiled, hidden, an object revealed only at the right moment. A mystery, but not for your sake, for his. The groom would be the one to lift the veil, unveiling not just your face but his new possession in front of the court. The ceremony itself was drenched in ritual, and none of it was really for you. Priests intoned Latin prayers you could barely understand, not because you weren't educated, but because even queens weren't meant to interpret scripture for themselves. The church reminded you at every step that this union wasn't about your happiness, but about God's order, which was conveniently indistinguishable from your husband's authority. Your consent was irrelevant. Your silence was assumed to be obedience. The vows you repeated were not a declaration of love. They were a binding, a reminder that from this day forward, you owed loyalty, fidelity, and fertility to the man standing beside you, regardless of whether he was kind or cruel. Meanwhile, the eyes of the court were on you, scanning every gesture for meaning. Did you smile enough? Did you look properly humble? Did your gown shimmer as much as the dowry it represented? You weren't a person. You were a message. To foreign ambassadors, your marriage announced alliances and peace. To nobles at home, it declared the strength of your dynasty. To the church, it reinforced the sanctity of its authority. And to your family, it meant the successful exchange of their daughter for power. To you, it meant a stranger's hand gripping yours while everyone cheered as though you had won a prize. In truth, the prize had been claimed by him. The feast afterward, that great celebration sung about in chronicles and toasted with barrels of wine, was another ordeal. You were paraded into the great hall, the heavy gown now stained with sweat beneath your arms, your cheeks aching from the forced smile plastered across your face. Musicians played, nobles shouted, servants carried and roasted animals by the dozens. People laughed and toasted, raised goblets to your health, all while dissecting every glance you shared with your new husband. And when you picked at your food, too nauseous from nerves to eat, whispers started immediately. Was the bride too delicate? Was she sickly? Would she bear children? Even your appetite became part of the performance. By the time the feasting ended, your body was exhausted, your head pounding from incense, perfume, and the sheer weight of the veil pressing on your skull all day. But your night was not over. Everyone knew what was coming next. The consummation was not just expected, it was public business. In some courts, guests would follow the couple to the bedchamber, cheering as the bride was laid down, pulling back the sheets and leaving only when the groom climbed in. In others, the sheets would later be inspected for proof of virginity, as though your body was not yours but an estate to be notarized. There was no privacy, no tenderness, no chance for consent. There was only duty. The morning after, you weren't simply a married woman. You were a fertility trophy. Your worth from then on would be measured by the swell of your stomach, the cries of newborns, and the survival of heirs. Your wedding day, dressed up in velvet and jewels, was really the start of your obligation to reproduce on command. And if you failed, if the crib stayed empty, all the splendor of that day would mean nothing. You would be whispered about, pitied, or worse, accused. The dress, the veil, the endless vows. They weren't signs of glory. They were shackles. So when stories today tell of royal weddings filled with pageantry, of queens gliding down aisles with jewels glittering in their hair, they forget the truth. Those gowns were heavy with debt. Those veils suffocated, and those ceremonies were less about love than about power. The day that should have been yours was never really yours at all. It belonged to the court, to the church, to the man beside you, to everyone but you. And beneath the pearls and the hymns, the only person missing from your wedding was you. The moment the wedding feast ended, when the music finally faltered and the candles burned low, the most humiliating chapter of your new life began. The public spectacle of the vows and the procession wasn't the end of the ceremony, only the prelude. Everyone in that great hall knew what came next. Not a quiet night with your new husband. Not a moment of tenderness. The consummation, a clinical word for what was, in reality, one of the most degrading performances you would ever endure. The whispers followed you from the banquet table to the bridal chamber. You were expected to prove, in the most physical way possible, that you were both untouched and now, officially, claimed. The bedchamber was no sanctuary. It was a stage. In some courts, guests followed you inside, laughing, toasting, pulling at your gown with eager hands until you stood in your shift, your body displayed like meat at the market. In others, the ritual was more symbolic, but no less suffocating. You might be led to the bed by relatives in attendance, tucked in like a doll, while a crowd lingered at the door, ears pressed to wood, waiting for proof that the union had been sealed. Sometimes the bed itself was dragged into the hall after the act, sheets inspected for blood, stains presented like trophies to prove your virginity. A young girl's body was treated as evidence, the intimacy of your flesh reduced to courtroom exhibit. And then there was him, your husband, the man chosen for you by politics and gold, not affection. He might stumble into the room already drunk, reeking of wine and sweat, the smell of roasted meat still clinging to his beard. Or perhaps he was terrified, awkward, a boy as unready as you were, but taught that this was his duty, his right, his victory. Either way, romance was not in the room. Expectation was. The eyes of the court, the whispers of servants, the entire machinery of dynastic politics pressed down on that bed like a weight. Whatever happened between you was not about two people. It was about kingdoms, heirs, legitimacy. For you, the experience was often one of fear and pain. You were young, sometimes no more than 14, with little understanding of what was about to happen. No one had explained. No one prepared you. The church preached purity and obedience, but offered no kindness. Your mother may have whispered vague warnings. Your ladies-in-waiting may have smirked knowingly. But when the moment came, you were alone. Consent was not a question. Pleasure was not a possibility. It was expected that you lie still and endure, a silent vessel for the needs of a man who, more often than not, barely knew how to touch you without clumsiness or cruelty. And the horror didn't end when the act was over, because it wasn't really over. The evidence had to be presented. Servants might carry the stained sheets into the hall for the court to see, nobles craning their necks for a glimpse, priests nodding with satisfaction. If blood appeared, you were celebrated as pure, a proper bride. If it didn't, suspicion spread like rot. Were you truly untouched? Had your family lied? Were you a whore disguised in silk? Your entire reputation, your entire worth as queen, could be destroyed by the absence of a few drops of blood. Never mind that bodies are not uniform, that not every girl bleeds. Science and compassion had no place in this ritual. Only proof, humiliation, and gossip. Your husband, meanwhile, might smirk proudly, as though he had conquered territory rather than shared a bed. Or, if he had failed, if nerves, drunkenness, or inexperience left the sheets unstained, he carried his own shame. But his shame was never as dangerous as yours. A man might be mocked. A woman might be ruined. Queens before you had been sent away, cast out, annulled, accused of scandal because their wedding night failed to meet expectations. Your entire future could hinge on what happened in 1 hour, on one bed, while an impatient court tapped their feet just beyond the walls. And what of tenderness? Of connection? It was a fantasy. The poets wrote of love, of passion, of two souls uniting beneath candlelight. But in the bedchamber, the reality was different. Your new husband might grunt, finish quickly, and roll away, leaving you curled on damp sheets while the court outside murmured, waiting for proof. Or he might be so drunk he fell asleep before touching you at all, forcing you both to endure another day of whispers and another night of scrutiny. You weren't two people beginning a life together. You were two chess pieces forced into proximity, your bodies pawns on a board too vast and merciless to care. The cruelty of it all was how public it remained. Even after the ritual, your body continued to be discussed openly. Courtiers gossiped about whether the marriage had truly been consummated. Ambassadors sent reports back to foreign kings about the queen's performance in bed as though it were military intelligence. Your fertility was no longer private. It was debated at banquets, whispered in council chambers, speculated upon by servants in kitchens. And if your belly didn't swell with child soon enough, the blame always fell on you. Never on the man who might have been impotent, too drunk, or too cruel to care. Imagine the weight of lying in that bed, night after night, knowing that the entire kingdom was counting on your body to do its duty. The royal bed was not a place of rest. It was a factory floor, a courtroom, and a battlefield. You were judged by what happened there more than by any speech you made, any charity you gave, any wisdom you displayed. A queen could be clever, generous, even beloved, but without a bloody sheet and a child to prove it, she was nothing. So when you picture the royal wedding night as a romantic scene, candles flickering, whispered vows, gentle touches, erase it. Replace it with the sound of heavy boots stumbling on stone, the smell of ale, the sting of fabric scratching your skin, the terror of being exposed not just to a man, but to an entire court hungry for proof of your purity. That was the royal bed, not a place of love, not even a place of privacy. Just another stage in the endless performance of being queen, where your body was never your own, and where even the most intimate moment was turned into public property. Congratulations, you've made it through the wedding, the bloody sheets, and the whispers of the court. You now hold the title of queen, with all the glittering crowns and velvet robes that implies, but don't get too comfortable in your throne. Your real job has nothing to do with ruling, advising, or even smiling at banquets. Your new job is far simpler and far more brutal. You exist to make sons, not children, not a happy family. Sons, heirs, breathing little bundles of dynastic insurance who can grow up to keep the crown secure. Everything else you do, from embroidery to diplomacy, is just background decoration compared to this one requirement. Fail at it, and your throne, your marriage, and sometimes even your head are on the chopping block. From the moment you were led into the royal bed, your body stopped being yours. It became a national project, Courtiers watched your waistline more closely than your husband ever would. If you ate too much bread, whispers began. If you looked pale, speculation followed. A single missed period could send the palace into a frenzy of prayers, wagers, and political scheming. And if that pregnancy ended in tragedy, as it often did, the grief wasn't yours to keep. It became a public scandal. A miscarriage was never called an accident. It was a failure. Your failure. Proof, in their eyes, that you weren't fit for the only role you had. The role of womb with a crown. It didn't matter that medicine barely existed, that infection was everywhere, that most women in medieval Europe buried multiple infants before their own 30th birthdays. You weren't allowed excuses. A stillbirth wasn't nature's cruelty. It was your incompetence. A daughter wasn't a blessing. She was a disappointment wrapped in swaddling cloth. Every royal woman learned quickly that giving birth to a girl meant enduring the disappointed sighs of courtiers, the tight smile of your husband, the letters from foreign ambassadors describing your delicate failure. A girl was a liability. A boy was a miracle. And the odds were stacked monstrously against you. Pregnancy itself was a gamble. Each time you conceived, you were essentially buying another ticket in a deadly lottery. There were no prenatal checkups, no sterile tools, no knowledge of what germs were or how to stop them. You hoped the baby positioned itself correctly, that your body could withstand the endless bleeding, and that no infection would set in after the birth. Midwives could do little beyond herbal remedies, whispered prayers, and the occasional attempt at turning the child with their bare hands. If labor went wrong, you screamed for hours or days, your body tearing apart while the church bells rang for mercy. And if by some miracle you survived, the infant might not. Cold nights, contaminated milk, or a cough could kill the heir you had risked your life to deliver. And yet, even when death stalked you with every birth, no one showed pity. Childbirth wasn't a private family moment. It was a royal performance. Attendants crowded the chamber to witness the delivery, making sure no trickery occurred, no substitution of infants. Queens often labored with a room full of whispering ladies, priests mumbling prayers in the corner, physicians fumbling with useless instruments, and nobles practically craning their necks to see if the baby was a boy. You lay there screaming, drenched in sweat, your body breaking apart, while strangers measured your worth by whether a penis emerged from between your legs. The danger wasn't only physical. The politics of childbirth could be lethal. If you failed to provide a male heir quickly enough, your husband had every excuse to discard you. Some queens were annulled, accused of barrenness, or quietly replaced with a more fertile bride. Others endured mistresses flaunted at court, women who bore the king's illegitimate sons while you sat on the throne watching your position erode with every giggle and every baby bump. The humiliation was sharpened by the fact that, in many cases, infertility had nothing to do with the woman at all. But no one dared blame the king. His virility was sacred. Your womb was the only suspect. The brutality of it all was how normal it became. From your first pregnancy to your last, you lived in cycles of expectation and fear. 9 months of whispers, followed by hours of agony, followed by years of guilt if the child died, followed by another round of prayers that maybe, this time, God would finally let you keep a son. You were praised as a saint when you succeeded, damned as a failure when you didn't, and mourned as little more than collateral damage when childbirth finally claimed you, as it did so many women. The average noblewoman spent most of her short life either pregnant, recovering from pregnancy, or dying from it. For queens, the pressure only made it worse, and don't imagine that even success brought relief. Having one son was not enough. You needed spares. Every disease, every accident, every war threatened to snatch away the fragile heir you produced. If you bore a boy, the court celebrated for a week, but by the next month, they were already pressuring you for another. A dynasty didn't survive on hope. It survived on numbers. Your sons weren't children. They were chess pieces. And you weren't their mother. You were the player expected to place them on the board before the enemy closed in. So picture it. Your body, broken again and again, swollen and stitched, your skin lined with scars, your bones weakened from endless labor. Each birth left you more fragile, more vulnerable, less able to face the next. You might lose teeth from malnutrition, collapse from blood loss, or suffer permanent injuries that made walking a challenge. And still the court would whisper, wondering when you'd try again, because as long as you lived, as long as your womb still worked, you were required to perform. The throne didn't care if you were exhausted. The kingdom didn't care if you were grieving. Your husband didn't care if you were terrified. Your only value was the sons you could make. That was the cruel truth of being queen. Not the jeweled crowns, not the silken gowns, not the portraits painted to show serene grace. The truth was a body racked with pain, a heart scarred by loss, and a life reduced to a single, merciless command: produce heirs or perish trying. Congratulations, your womb is now a matter of state security. Forget jewels, gowns, and the throne. The real crown sits inside your body, ticking away like a time bomb, because every pregnancy is a round of Russian roulette, where the prize is an heir and the cost is usually your life. You are not a woman anymore. You are not even a wife. You are a uterus wrapped in velvet and pearls, owned by the crown, monitored by the court, and prayed over by priests who have never once experienced childbirth but are quite confident in telling you how to do it. Every time your stomach swells, the kingdom swells with expectation. Every time it contracts, the midwives whisper prayers that you will both survive. But the odds are stacked against you before you even begin. Medicine in the Middle Ages is barely medicine at all. There are no sterile instruments, no painkillers, no antibiotics, no understanding of germs. Your physician believes illness is caused by unbalanced humors, evil spirits, or maybe the fact that you dared to eat pears on a Friday. He will happily bleed you with leeches in your third trimester, because what your weakened body really needs while carrying a child is less blood. Midwives, often your only hope, rely on a mixture of herbal remedies, charms, and sheer grit. But even the most skilled among them can't stop a breech baby from suffocating you both. Labor itself is nothing short of an ordeal. When the time comes, you are surrounded not by comfort, but by spectators. The room fills with ladies in waiting, servants, physicians, and priests. Privacy doesn't exist because everyone must verify that your heir is legitimate, that the child sliding from your body is not a smuggled changeling swapped in by desperate courtiers. You scream, you sweat, you tear, and you bleed while half the court listens at the door for news. And they aren't waiting to hear if you lived. They're waiting to hear the sex of the child. The risk is omnipresent. Hemorrhage can drain your life away before anyone fetches a clean cloth. Puerperal fever, to what we now know as infection, can set in days later, leaving you shivering, delirious, and reeking as your body poisons itself from within. Retained placenta, obstructed labor, eclampsia, all death sentences then, each one ready to strike you down while priests recite the rosary at your bedside. Even something as simple as a careless midwife failing to wash her hands could end you. Not that anyone in the year 1300 has even thought to ask about hand washing. The statistics alone are a horror story. Somewhere between 1 in 3 and 1 in 4 women died of childbirth-related complications during their lifetimes, and queens were not spared. Catherine of Aragon lost child after child, suffering stillbirths and infant deaths until her surviving daughter Mary was all she had left. Jane Seymour, third wife of Henry VIII, gave him the son he craved and promptly died of puerperal fever 2 weeks later. Even the most exalted queens, with access to the best medical care money could buy, faced the same fate as any peasant giving birth on a dirt floor. Death was the great equalizer, and childbirth was its most loyal weapon. And yet you had no choice but to endure it, again and again. A single surviving son was not enough. Dynasties demanded spares. Princes died of fevers, accidents, or war before they ever reached the throne, which meant you were expected to risk your life repeatedly until you produced not one boy, but several, a brood of living insurance policies. The irony was suffocating. You might die giving birth to an heir who himself would not survive the winter. Your body became a battlefield, your womb a gamble, your blood the coin with which the kingdom purchased its future. What made it worse was how little your suffering mattered in the grand scheme. If you died, the king remarried. Another queen was brought in, another womb conscripted. You were mourned, yes, but mostly as a cautionary tale, a sad footnote in the annals of history. She gave us 3 children, 2 girls, and a sickly boy, before dying in childbed. That was your epitaph. Your existence reduced to a tally of womb productivity. The preparation for labor reflected this grim reality. Priests were often called to your chamber, not after, but before the birthing began. You confessed your sins, received your last rites, and prayed fervently while contractions ripped through your body. Imagine preparing for childbirth the same way one prepares for execution, because in truth, the odds weren't that different. Death was always in the room with you, lurking behind the midwife's shoulder, sharpening its scythe with every hour that dragged on. Even if you survived, you rarely emerged whole. Birth tore women apart physically. Prolapsed organs, torn muscles, chronic pain, and endless infections became your companions for life. Some queens walked with limps, others leaked urine uncontrollably. Many lost teeth from the malnutrition that came with repeated pregnancies. You weren't just surviving. You were being hollowed out, piece by piece, until your body was a fragile husk, still expected to smile at banquets and produce heirs until the day it finally gave up. And heaven forbid you bore only daughters. The strain, the agony, the risk, all dismissed as useless because the child you produced lacked the right genitalia. Kings raged, courts whispered, and suddenly your womb was not just unlucky but defective. Some queens were set aside or quietly shunted into convents, while others endured the humiliation of watching mistresses flaunt their healthy sons in court. All your pain meant nothing unless it ended in a boy. Pregnancy was never a celebration. It was a countdown, a clock that started the moment your belly swelled and ticked relentlessly toward either survival or death. The joy of motherhood was drowned in fear. You might cradle your infant for a week, a month, a year, and still lose him to disease. And when that happened, you had no time to grieve. The king would be waiting outside your chamber, already calculating when you might be fit to try again. So here's the truth stripped of fairy tale illusions. Being a queen was less about ruling and more about reproducing. Your body was never your own. It belonged to the dynasty, to the court, to the country. You were a womb with a crown, prayed over in cathedrals, spied on in your bedchamber, and buried in sanctified earth once your body finally failed. Your children were heirs, your pregnancies were policies, and your labor was not just childbirth. It was state business conducted in blood. You weren't a fairy tale queen. You were national property, and the price of serving your kingdom was often your life. Being a queen meant your womb was never private, never sacred, never even yours. It was public property, monitored with the obsessive attention of a paranoid kingdom, convinced the stability of the realm was hiding somewhere between your hips. The minute you were married, eyes followed you everywhere. Courtiers whispered when you took a second helping of bread. Maids reported if you vomited in the morning, and priests speculated whether your latest fainting spell was a miracle or an omen. It didn't matter if you had a stomachache from last night's spoiled meat. By dawn, the entire palace had already decided you were either pregnant or cursed. Your belly became theater. Every pound you gained or lost was dissected by nobles desperate for gossip. Was that a baby bump, or just too much wine at supper? Was the queen glowing from conception or flushed with fever? Servants were bribed to report on whether your courses had come that month. Ladies-in-waiting were interrogated like informants, asked if you looked more tired than usual, if your appetite had changed, if you'd been touching your stomach with suspicious tenderness. Your most intimate bodily functions were state secrets, yet everyone seemed to have access to them but you. And heaven help you if the months dragged on with no swelling to show. Whispers slithered through the corridors faster than any royal decree. Maybe the queen is barren. Maybe she's bewitched. Maybe God is punishing her for sins untold. The king, poor victim that he was, became the object of pity, while you, the woman failing to deliver, became the scapegoat. Never mind that your husband was drunk half the time, riddled with syphilis, or simply incapable of performing the one job required of him. Male fertility was not questioned. It was unthinkable. The blame always curled back to you like smoke from a candle, staining your reputation no matter how devoutly you prayed or how gracefully you smiled at feasts. Doctors, or rather, the men who called themselves physicians, offered no comfort. They poked, prodded, and prescribed remedies that bordered on torture. If your belly stayed flat, they suggested bloodletting to cleanse your humors, or purges of rancid herbs to make your womb more welcoming. Some ordered you to drink bizarre concoctions of ground pearls, powdered toads, or goat urine. Others recommended you sleep with amulets dangling from your neck, charms blessed by priests who muttered that your womb might simply be too cold for life. None of it worked. What it did do was leave you weaker, sicker, and more convinced that your body was betraying you in front of the entire court. Meanwhile, the gossip sharpened. Childless queens became magnets for slander. People muttered that you must be hiding a deformity, that you had secretly borne stillborn monstrosities, or that demons had nested in your womb. Some whispered darker accusations, that you were cursed by witches, that you were a witch yourself, or that God had sealed your womb as punishment for pride. The cruelest rumors even suggested that your infertility was deliberate, that you were poisoning yourself to deny the king his heirs. And every whisper mattered, because enough of them could topple you from your throne. The irony was that even when you did conceive, your body was still never your own. Pregnancy wasn't a joy. It was surveillance turned suffocation. Every time you craved food, every time you cringed at smells, every time you shifted in your chair, the entire court took note. You weren't allowed to be nauseous without sparking celebration or panic. If you miscarried, the tragedy wasn't yours. It was a public scandal. Nobles speculated whether you had failed morally, whether you had angered the heavens, whether perhaps you had stumbled too clumsily on purpose. Your grief was dissected and catalogued, a tool for gossip and political maneuvering. The paranoia didn't stop with courtiers. Kings themselves often joined the chorus. Some doubted their wives openly, accusing them of witchcraft or unchastity when heirs failed to appear. Henry VIII went through wives like a butcher through cattle, each one blamed for his lack of sons while his own health and habits remained unquestioned. Others quietly took mistresses, flaunting their bastards to remind you that the problem clearly wasn't theirs. And if those bastards thrived while your belly remained flat, your days as queen were numbered. You weren't a partner in power. You were a fertility project with a ticking deadline. And then there was the constant, exhausting theater of piety. To survive the rumors, you prayed publicly and constantly, kneeling until your knees throbbed on cold stone floors, lighting candles until your fingers blistered, fasting until your stomach curled in agony. Every chapel visit was a performance, a desperate attempt to prove that you were not barren by choice, that you were not cursed, that you were not secretly in league with the devil. The court watched you even here, tallying the sincerity of your sobs, the length of your vigils, the fervor of your whispered pleas. Your prayers were not between you and God. They were another form of gossip, another arena for judgment. Even your own household wasn't safe. Ladies-in-waiting speculated when they dressed you in the morning, noting whether your gowns fit tighter than usual. Midwives inspected you like livestock, muttering about the tilt of your pelvis or the health of your menses. Servants carried your chamber pot and gossiped about its contents, spreading tales of whether your urine smelled of pregnancy or illness. Every single detail of your body was fodder for the rumor mill. Every flush of your cheek or flutter of your stomach, a headline in the ongoing soap opera of your supposed fertility. Living like this was a slow form of madness. You couldn't eat without wondering what story the crumbs on your plate would tell. You couldn't lie down without fearing someone would interpret it as exhaustion from secret pregnancy. Even your silence could betray you. Smile too much, and you were clearly hiding news. Smile too little, and you were obviously despairing over your barrenness. There was no winning, no refuge, no part of your body or mind that wasn't claimed by the court's endless buzzing speculation. And the cruelest part? If you ever did manage to carry a child to term, the gossip didn't stop. It only shifted. Was the baby healthy? Was it a boy? Was it strong enough to survive its first winter? And if it wasn't, if the child died before baptism or after only a few fragile months, the whispers returned sharper than ever. Maybe the queen's womb was poisoned. Maybe she was too sinful to nurture life. Maybe God himself had weighed her and found her wanting. In the fairy tales, queens cradle golden-haired princes, while courtiers cheer and bells toll in celebration. In reality, queens cradled rumor, suspicion, and the gnawing terror of failure. Their bellies were battlegrounds, their bodies dissected by gossip, their private grief paraded as public spectacle. You weren't just expected to produce heirs. You were expected to do it under the eyes of an entire nation, waiting eagerly for proof that you could bleed, swell, suffer, and deliver on command. Your body was never your own. It was a palace stage, and the audience was always waiting for the curtain to rise. Being queen didn't mean being cherished. It meant being tolerated, paraded, and occasionally humiliated for the amusement of others. If you thought the crown bought loyalty, think again, because the king, your husband, was almost certainly cheating on you, and he wasn't doing it quietly behind locked doors. He was doing it openly, shamelessly, with a grin stretched across his wine-stained teeth while courtiers snickered in the corners. His mistress wasn't some secret shame. She was practically a fixture of the palace, and everyone from the lowest scullery maid to the highest duke knew it. You didn't just endure it. You were expected to smile through it. The cruelty of it wasn't only in the betrayal, but in the spectacle. Mistresses were rarely hidden away. They were paraded like exotic pets, dressed in silks, dripping with jewels, riding in carriages you were supposed to command. Sometimes they even dined at your table, laughing too loudly, their fingers grazing the king's hand, while yours clutched your goblet with enough force to crack it. Courtiers whispered about how pretty she looked compared to you, how youthful, how charming, how fertile. They delighted in the contrast because it made them feel part of the drama, insiders to the royal soap opera that was your marriage. And the king himself, bloated on power and entitlement, felt no shame. Why would he? A man's infidelity wasn't considered weakness. It was proof of virility. The more women he kept, the more powerful he appeared. It didn't matter that his mistresses mocked you with their eyes, or that his bastards toddled around the castle courtyards while your own womb was scrutinized like a faulty reliquary. His pleasure was celebrated, while your pain was dismissed. Even worse, mistresses often wielded political power that should have been yours. Some became unofficial advisors, whispering in his ear while you were shunted to the background. They influenced appointments, treaties, even wars. Diplomats, instead of bowing to you, sometimes slipped bribes to his latest favorite. Knowing her pillow talk mattered more than your carefully prepared counsel. You, the crowned queen, could be outranked by a giggling girl with painted cheeks and a low neckline. Nothing could make the humiliation sting more sharply. Your position, fragile as spun glass, offered no real protection. You couldn't rage, couldn't retaliate, couldn't even glare too long without risking disaster. The moment you lashed out, the court would brand you jealous, hysterical, unfit for dignity. Worse, the king could twist your outrage into grounds for punishment. A queen who dared to shame her husband risked being discarded, locked away in a convent, or quietly poisoned under the guise of illness. Your silence wasn't weakness, it was survival. And yet, silence was its own torment. You smiled until your jaw ached. You laughed politely, while the mistress flaunted new jewels you recognized as gifts you were supposed to receive. You endured whispered jokes about how the king prefers fresher fruit, while swallowing the bile rising in your throat. Your humiliation became palace entertainment, a story retold with relish in noble halls and common taverns alike. Everyone knew, everyone watched, everyone judged. Sometimes, mistresses weren't content to simply exist. They sought to eclipse you entirely. They flaunted their intimacy, appearing at feasts with swollen bellies, daring the world to compare their fertile hips to yours. Some wore gowns designed to mimic royal attire, a mockery of your position, their very presence blurring the line between queen and concubine. The court adored the scandal, feeding on the tension like vultures circling a carcass. You couldn't move without their eyes slicing you open, waiting for the tiniest sign of cracks in your facade. It wasn't just gossip, it was danger. Every child born of a mistress was a potential threat, a bastard who might one day rally factions and challenge the legitimacy of your own offspring. Entire wars had been sparked by whispered doubts about who was truly the king's favored blood. Your future, your children's lives, your dynasty, all of it could be undone by one man's wandering lust. And still, you were expected to bow your head and endure. Queens didn't get to rage. Queens didn't get to weep in public. Queens were supposed to embody patience, grace, and endurance, no matter how deep the knife twisted. Behind closed doors, you might cry into your pillow, tear at your rosary, or whisper furious prayers for divine justice. But when the doors opened, you had to stand tall, your crown gleaming as though humiliation didn't drip from its edges. Some queens tried to outmaneuver the humiliation by cultivating their own allies, surrounding themselves with loyal courtiers, priests, or even lovers in secret. But the risks were catastrophic. A king's infidelity was a sport. A queen's infidelity was treason. A king could father bastards by the dozen and still be celebrated at feasts. A queen, even suspected of straying, could be dragged to the scaffold. The double standard wasn't subtle. It was law. Your fidelity wasn't about love. It was about property, bloodlines, control. Your body was chained to loyalty, even as his wandered freely. And yet, even queens who never faltered were not safe. History is littered with royal wives discarded like pawns when their husbands grew tired of them or convinced themselves God was punishing their reign through childlessness. Catherine of Aragon wept through years of humiliation as Henry VIII paraded Anne Boleyn, her lady-in-waiting, in front of her. Queens across Europe watched younger women slip into their husbands' arms and knew their crowns could be next. So you played the part. You kept your face serene, your voice measured, your manners impeccable. You lived every day in the shadow of betrayal, surrounded by eyes that delighted in your shame. Because being queen didn't mean being loved. It meant being trapped in a gilded cage while your husband flaunted the key, dangling it before the world as proof of his power. And the cruelest truth of all, no one pitied you. Not the courtiers who feasted on scandal, not the peasants who assumed your jewels cushioned every sorrow, not even your husband who saw you as expendable. You were queen, yes, but you were also spectacle, sacrifice, and symbol. And your suffering was never private. It was policy. So you think you've made it. You've survived the marriage market, the public humiliation of your wedding night, the endless scrutiny of your womb, and now you're in your new home, the royal palace. You picture stone walls, roaring fireplaces, velvet cushions, a life of comfort where servants rush to fulfill your every whim, except no. What you actually get is a freezing, drafty prison, a place where the walls drip with smoke, the floors crawl with vermin, and your every move is watched, recorded, and whispered about by an army of spies disguised as servants. A palace is not a home. It's a cage with chandeliers. Let's start with the structure itself. Castles were not designed for comfort. They were designed for defense. That means stone walls several feet thick, tiny arrow-slit windows, and ceilings high enough to echo every cough in winter. In theory, this makes you safe from invaders. In practice, it means you live inside a damp refrigerator. The hearth in your chamber glows red at night, but most of the heat disappears straight up the chimney. The rest of the room remains an icebox. You shuffle around wrapped in furs, your breath fogging the air, your teeth chattering as you try to write a letter with fingers too stiff to hold a quill. And when it isn't cold, it's smoky. Fireplaces don't draft properly, so the air inside your chambers often fills with a choking haze. Your eyes water constantly, your lungs burn, and your silk gown ends up smelling like it was marinated in campfire ash. Ventilation barely exists, so the smoke lingers and clings. Add to that the stench of unwashed bodies, rotting rushes strewn across the floor, and chamber pots emptied only when someone remembers, and you've got an aroma no amount of rosewater can disguise. The palace doesn't smell like power. It smells like mildew and smoke trapped together in a stone box. Then there's the infestation. Rats scurry through the kitchens, mice chew holes in the tapestries, fleas hop across every rug and blanket. You can feel them biting at your ankles even during council meetings. Cats help, but they bring their own gifts. Half-dead birds left on your bed, feathers scattered across the flagstones. Bedbugs are a fact of life, burrowing into your mattress, feasting on your skin while you sleep. No amount of lavender sachets or holy water makes a difference. The palace is alive, and not in a way you want. But even if you could ignore the cold, the smoke, and the vermin, you can't escape the people. A queen is never alone. From the moment you wake, you are surrounded by attendants, ladies-in-waiting, and chambermaids who hover while you're still half asleep. Privacy doesn't exist. Your body is a public object. You're dressed by others, bathed by others, even prayed over by others. Each servant has a role, and each role is another set of eyes. Their loyalty isn't to you. It's to whoever pays them better, which means everything you do is reported, twisted, and repeated until it becomes gossip, and gossip in a royal court can kill. Every corridor in the palace is full of spies. Some are obvious, like the chamberlain who hovers too long when you meet a foreign envoy. Others are subtler, like the servant who smiles sweetly while pouring your wine and then delivers every detail of your dinner conversation to the king's mistress before the night is over. You can't trust anyone, even your ladies-in-waiting. Girls raised with you, sometimes friends from childhood, have their own alliances. They might laugh with you during embroidery, but whisper your complaints to the bishop an hour later. It's less a household and more a theater of surveillance. Every gesture scrutinized, every sigh interpreted. And then there's protocol, endless suffocating protocol. Being queen doesn't mean freedom. It means routine carved in stone. You wake at the same hour, eat at the same hour, attend mass at the same hour. When you walk, it's along prescribed routes. When you sit, it's on a throne carefully placed to display your body as a symbol. When you speak, it's through layers of ritualized words designed to strip them of meaning. You are not a woman with moods and opinions. You are an emblem, and that emblem must never slip. Meals are no relief. Banquets look glorious in paintings. Golden plates, dripping roasts, goblets of ruby wine. In reality, you sit through hours of ceremony before you can even taste food. Courtiers watch every bite you take, every swallow, every frown. If you reach for the wrong dish, someone interprets it as a political statement. If you leave food uneaten, rumors start about illness or pregnancy. And the food itself? Half the time it's lukewarm by the time it reaches you, crawling with grease, or spiced so heavily it burns your mouth. But you smile anyway, because queens don't gag. Even in the rare moments when you retreat to your chambers, you're not free. Your letters are intercepted and read. Your visitors are recorded. The tapestries on the wall don't just hide drafts. They hide listening ears. You pace the floor, whispering prayers under your breath, knowing full well that someone will repeat them in the morning, stripped of context, exaggerated into something dangerous. Loneliness in the palace isn't about being alone. It's about being trapped in a crowd where not a single soul can be trusted. At night, when the corridors finally fall silent and the candles are extinguished, the palace becomes worse. The walls groan, rats scurry, and the wind whistles through cracks in the stone. Shadows stretch across your chamber, and every sound is magnified into menace. You lie under layers of blankets, scratching at flea bites, listening to your own heart race as you wonder whether the servant carrying your water tonight was bribed to slip poison into it. Even sleep isn't safety. Dreams of freedom dissolve into the reality of waking in the same prison of stone and eyes. Because that's the truth. A palace isn't a sanctuary, it's a performance hall. It's a maze of stone where the drafts cut like knives, where your body is always on display, where betrayal seeps in through the walls as steadily as the damp. You don't live in a palace, you endure it. And every morning, when the chamber doors open and another day of scrutiny begins, you remind yourself that being queen doesn't mean being powerful. It means being trapped in luxury so cold it burns. The paintings lie. In every portrait you've ever seen of a medieval queen, she looks magnificent, draped in velvet, dripping with jewels, her crown perfectly straight, as if gravity itself shows her respect. But behind that glossy paint and carefully arranged folds of cloth was a different reality, one far less glamorous. Because being dressed like a queen was not a privilege. It was a punishment wrapped in velvet. Every day you were stuffed into layers of garments so heavy they turned walking into a workout, stitched into fabrics that trapped heat, sweat, and every odor your body could produce. You didn't glide down marble halls. You lumbered, stiff and sweating, while your ladies-in-waiting adjusted hems and yanked at laces to keep you upright. Start with the gown itself. Royal fashion wasn't designed for comfort or practicality. It was a weapon of display, a way to remind everyone watching that you were more than human, that your body was a walking billboard for wealth and status. That meant dresses weighing 30, 40, sometimes even 50 pounds, made of stiff brocade, fur trim, velvet so thick it could double as a horse blanket, and embroidery crusted with gold thread and jewels. Try sitting in that without feeling like you're being pressed into the chair like dough under a rolling pin. Try climbing a staircase while dragging a hem so long it collects every clump of dirt, stray feather, and rat dropping on the floor. And remember, these gowns weren't tailored to flatter you. They were designed to flatten you, to crush your body into a rigid silhouette that made you look less like a person and more like a monument. Then came the underlayers. Long linen shifts meant to absorb sweat. Except linen wasn't washed often, so they absorbed it once, twice, 300 times, until the fabric turned into stiff yellow parchment that chafed your skin raw. Corsets and bodices were laced so tightly you couldn't bend at the waist, couldn't breathe deeply, couldn't even laugh without feeling your ribs creak like a breaking doorframe. People romanticize corsets as elegant, sexy things. In truth, They were instruments of suffocation, tools that reshaped your body into what men decided power looked like. A queen could deliver a speech, bear a child, or host a banquet while gasping for air like a fish in a net. And while you're stewing in this cloth coffin, don't forget hygiene, or the lack of it. Laundry was not a daily activity. It wasn't even weekly. Gowns were too heavy, too delicate, too expensive to be scrubbed with soap and boiling water. At best, they were brushed down, spritzed with rose water, maybe sprinkled with herbs to mask the stench, which means those rich velvets and satins weren't fresh. They were humid little terrariums for bacteria, sweat, and food crumbs dropped during feasts. Your gown didn't sparkle. It smelled like a compost heap wrapped in fur. Deodorant didn't exist either. You covered the smell of your body with perfume, if you had access to it, but perfume was expensive and cloying. Most of the time, you simply endured the reek. Everyone smelled bad, which meant no one smelled bad enough to comment on it. But as queen, you were surrounded constantly by people standing inches from your skin, ladies adjusting your sleeves, bishops leaning in to whisper blessings, courtiers kissing your hand. Every moment you prayed that the bouquet of sweat, smoke, and damp wool rising from your body wasn't strong enough to make someone gag. And then there was the crown. Yes, the crown looks beautiful in portraits, but in reality it was a torture device perched on your head. Crowns were heavy, sharp-edged, and lined with fabrics that weren't exactly pest-proof. Hair washing was rare, lice were inevitable, and the warm, dark space under your circlet was prime real estate for entire colonies of insects. Imagine delivering a royal decree while tiny creatures scuttled along your scalp, feasting on your blood, hidden under the jewels that were supposed to symbolize your glory. You couldn't scratch, of course. Scratching in public was unseemly. So, you smiled through clenched teeth while your head became a banquet for vermin. Shoes didn't help either. Delicate silk slippers looked fine in paintings, but were useless in actual palaces, where floors were drafty, muddy, and littered with refuse. Wooden pattens clomped loudly, leather boots soaked up every puddle, and fancier footwear often shredded your feet with blisters. Heels weren't a fashion statement yet. They were a medieval joke, where you either tripped in front of a crowd or ruined your arches permanently. Meanwhile, stockings sagged and bunched around your ankles, itchy wool rubbing your skin until it broke into rashes that never healed in the damp palace air. Getting dressed each morning was its own ordeal. Queens didn't simply pull on clothes. Dressing was a ritual involving a small army of attendants. You stood in your chamber shivering while half a dozen women tugged, tied, and pinned you into your layers. If one lace was crooked, if one sleeve wasn't sitting right, the whole process stopped and restarted. The weight settled on you slowly, one piece at a time, until you could barely move. Then came the jewelry. Rings that cut off your circulation, necklaces so heavy they bent your neck forward, earrings that yanked at your lobes until they tore. And when it was all done, you weren't transformed into a goddess. You were transformed into a gilded statue, trapped in fabric and metal, expected to smile as if you weren't suffocating. Undressing at night wasn't freedom either. Removing each layer was just as laborious, and once everything was off, your body carried the evidence. Red grooves from laces etched into your flesh, bruises on your ribs where the corset pressed, heat rashes under your arms, sores on your feet. The relief of shedding the gown was real, but so was the dread of knowing you'd have to wear it all again the next morning. Your wardrobe wasn't a luxury. It was a cycle of daily torment disguised as glamour, and all the while, everyone around you admired your appearance. Courtiers praised the richness of your gown. Foreign envoys complimented your radiance. Artists sketched you into eternity with perfect posture and serene expressions. No one wrote about the fleas burrowing under your crown, or the sweat soaking your corset, or the way your toes bled into your stockings. You were beautiful, they said, but beauty, in the medieval palace, was just another word for suffering in silence. That's the truth of a queen's wardrobe. Velvet, jewels, and crowns weren't markers of luxury. They were tools of confinement, instruments that displayed your body while slowly destroying it. You didn't wear your clothes, they wore you. And every time you looked in the mirror, you saw not a woman, but an artifact, draped in fabrics that belonged more to politics than to comfort. The gowns were heavy, the air was rank, and under the glittering crown you itched. The banquet table of a medieval queen sparkles in paintings and storybooks. Long stretches of gold platters, roasted boars, candied fruits, towers of bread, and jewel-colored goblets filled with wine. It looks like paradise, the kind of spread that would make a modern Michelin star chef weep with envy. But pull back the gilded curtain and the truth is less mouth-watering and more stomach-churning. Being a queen didn't mean you ate better than anyone else. It meant you were trapped at a table piled with food that was spoiled, dangerous, and almost certainly crawling with rats under the tablecloth. Dinner wasn't a pleasure. It was a performance in survival. Start with the meat, because every feast centered around it. Whole animals roasted on spits, great haunches of beef carved theatrically, fowl stuffed with other fowl, as if culinary matryoshka dolls. The sight was impressive, but the reality was grim. Meat preservation in the Middle Ages was essentially wishful thinking. Salt it, smoke it, maybe pickle it if you had the patience. But none of that stopped meat from turning foul after a few days. By the time it hit your table, it had often been hanging around long enough to develop a perfume of rot. The solution wasn't throwing it out. It was covering the stink with spices. Cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, black pepper, saffron, all ground into the sauce, not to delight your palate, but to keep you from gagging. A dish might look glossy and rich, but under the glaze was meat so questionable even a dog might hesitate. And if the spice cabinet was bare, cooks got creative with vinegar, honey, or wine, masking decay with acid and sugar. Fruit and vegetables, if they appeared, weren't fresh either. Apples stored in barrels until they turned wrinkled and soft. Pears fermented into near liquor, beans boiled until they collapsed into gray mush. Salads weren't a thing. Raw vegetables were considered dangerous, practically uncivilized. Anything green was either cooked beyond recognition or turned into a paste. What survived the pot came seasoned with grit from poorly ground flour or the faint crunch of insects that slipped in during storage. The beautiful glazed pies that nobles bragged about, often stuffed with minced scraps of dubious meat, sometimes padded with breadcrumbs or even sawdust to stretch them further. Imagine biting into what looks like a juicy pastry only to chew on something that tastes like a mixture of candle wax and wet feathers. That was dessert. Bread was the most reliable part of the meal, but even that came with risks. In bad harvest years, bakers mixed flour with ground acorns, bean powder, or, worse, ergot-infected rye. Ergot, a poisonous fungus, could turn your loaf into a hallucinogenic nightmare that caused convulsions, gangrene, or sudden death. And since food testing involved nothing more than taking a bite and waiting to see what happened, you never really knew whether your bread would fill you or finish you. And then there was the wine. Ah yes, endless goblets of ruby liquid, a queen's indulgence. Except most medieval wine was sour, unstable, and often watered down with whatever liquid was closest at hand. If you were lucky, that meant clean well water. If you weren't, it meant the same murky water everyone used to dump waste into. People added herbs, honey, or even chalk to mask the taste. Beer and ale were safer, but safer doesn't mean tasty. Weak ale was lukewarm, flat, and carried hints of the barrel it had been fermenting in. A barrel that might have been scraped out of a barn only weeks earlier. Your royal toast tasted less like celebration and more like desperation. All of this might have been survivable if you could eat in peace. But as queen, mealtime was never private. You ate under the eyes of the entire court, courtiers studying every bite, every sip, every glance. You couldn't wrinkle your nose at the smell of spoiled mutton. You couldn't push away a bowl of slimy stew. You had to smile, chew, and pretend you were enjoying yourself while swallowing down bile and dread. Because beyond the rot and filth, there lurked another danger that no amount of spices could cover up. Poison. Poison was the great paranoia of every queen's life. It could be in your cup, your stew, your bread. It could come from your enemies, from rivals at court, even from your own husband if he tired of you. Assassination wasn't always done with swords. Sometimes it came in the form of a sweetened tart, laced with arsenic. To guard against this, queens often had food tasters, unfortunate souls who had to take the first bite. If they keeled over, you knew not to eat it. If they didn't, well, maybe the dose was slow acting. Either way, your appetite was ruined. Every sip of wine felt like a gamble. Every mouthful of venison could be your last. Poison wasn't just a possibility, it was an expectation. A rumor whispered behind fans and goblets, a story traded in the shadows of the hall. Even if your food was safe from enemies, it wasn't safe from pests. Palaces were crawling with rats and mice, scurrying under tables, nibbling at crumbs, darting across rush-covered floors. Kitchens were breeding grounds for vermin, where half-prepared dishes sat uncovered, giving rodents and insects free rein. Cats prowled the halls, not as pets, but as pest control. The same meat brought to your golden plate might have been tasted first by a rat only hours earlier. Imagine sitting at the high table while you can hear scratching and squeaking beneath the rushes, little claws scampering around your feet as you sip your watered wine. Bon appétit. And all of this abundance, this supposed luxury, wasn't really for you anyway. Feasts were political theater, staged for alliances, visiting dignitaries, or simply to remind everyone of your husband's wealth and your kingdom's power. You were the centerpiece, a jewel perched above the spread, but your role wasn't to eat, it was to be watched. You took dainty bites, careful sips, and endured the hunger gnawing in your stomach, while the men beside you gorged themselves. The queen wasn't allowed gluttony. The queen was an ornament in a velvet cage, surrounded by food that symbolized plenty but delivered nothing but sickness, fear, and humiliation. So when you picture a queen's feast, forget the glossy tables of Renaissance paintings. Forget the roasted swans with gilded feathers, the sugared fruits glowing in candlelight. Replace them with rancid meat buried under spice, bread that could rot your brain, and goblets trembling in your hands as you wondered whether this would be the drink that killed you. Add the soundtrack of rats squeaking in the shadows, courtiers whispering about your fertility while you chew, and the knowledge that everyone at the table was waiting to see if you dropped dead before dessert. That was dinner for a queen. A battlefield disguised as a banquet, a table fit for royalty and for rats. The image of a queen shimmering in silk, skin flawless, hair shining, and perfume trailing delicately in her wake is just that, an image. A fantasy painted centuries later to erase the stench of reality. Because the truth is this, queens reeked. Everyone did. Bathing in medieval Europe was not daily, not weekly, sometimes not even monthly. The bathhouse, once common in earlier centuries, had become synonymous with sin, sex, and corruption. By the time you wore your crown, stepping into a tub of hot water was viewed with suspicion, even scandal. So instead of soap and water, you masked your filth with perfume, rose water, and herbs stuffed into your gowns. You might look magnificent in your portraits, but beneath the velvet, you stank like everyone else. Part of it was fear. Doctors, such as they were, preached that warm water opened the pores, leaving the body vulnerable to disease. The more you bathed, the more illness could seep in. They told queens to avoid it for their health, which meant washing became an act of danger rather than cleanliness. Bathhouses, where men and women once gathered, were declared dens of immorality by the church, tainted places where lust and plague flourished side by side. A queen was expected to be holy, untouchable, She couldn't risk scandal by being spotted there, even if the steaming water promised relief. So you stayed in your palace chambers, layers of fabric piling up on your skin until sweat glued them to you like a second hide. Instead of washing, queens relied on ritualized cleansing. Servants brought bowls of water for you to dab at your hands and face, but that was the extent of it. A damp cloth on your cheeks, maybe a rinse of your fingers before a meal, was supposed to count as hygiene. Your body, however, told another story. Armpits, feet, groin, all went unwashed for weeks. You stuffed yourself into corsets and bodices, the sweat soaking into the linen shifts beneath, and those shifts weren't scrubbed daily either. At best, they were rinsed now and then, but soap was rare and expensive. Most of the time, fabrics were worn until they could stand up on their own. You carried your own musk with you everywhere, and so did everyone else. Perfume became the great cover-up. Oils of rose, lavender, musk, ambergris, liquid illusions dabbed at the wrists, dripped into hair, splashed onto gowns. But perfume didn't clean. It layered. The result was less floral bouquet and more suffocating cloud of rot mingled with sweetness. Imagine a body unwashed for weeks, then doused in sticky resinous oils. That was the scent of royalty. Strong enough to announce your arrival in a hall, strong enough to make courtiers gag behind their sleeves, but not strong enough to convince anyone you were actually clean. Perfume didn't prevent disease either. If anything, it drew vermin. Fleas and lice were just as attracted to the oils as they were to sweat. You smelled like a feast, and your scalp was their banquet table. Lice were the most loyal subjects a queen ever had. They nested under crowns, burrowed into wigs, crawled along seams of gowns, and nipped at flesh beneath jewelry. Combing them out was a daily ritual, one you endured while sitting in front of your ladies-in-waiting, as though picking parasites from your scalp was no more embarrassing than brushing your hair. Fleas jumped freely from your skirts to the skirts of courtiers. Bedbugs spread in mattresses shared by nobles and peasants alike. Bathing might have drowned some of these invaders, but since bathing was frowned upon, you carried them with you, like silent courtiers, crawling across your skin in the middle of mass, while you forced yourself to sit motionless. Even queens who dared to bathe weren't free of misery. The tubs themselves were wooden, filled by servants hauling endless buckets of water, which cooled before you could soak. Soap was made from animal fat and lye, harsh and foul-smelling, leaving your skin raw. And the very act of bathing was sometimes seen as indulgent, even indecent. You could spend an hour steeping in warm water only to emerge to rumors that you had behaved sinfully, exposing your body to the devil's temptation. A clean queen risked a dirty reputation, so instead, you prayed and perfumed. You sprinkled rose water on your hands before guests arrived, dabbed lavender oil on your temples, burned incense in your chambers to disguise the reek of smoke, sweat, and rot. You washed your hair only rarely, combing through grease until it clumped, then powdering it with ground herbs or even flour to soak up the oil. Crowns and veils hid the worst of it in public, but in private, your hair was a waxy mat crawling with life, and everyone pretended not to notice. What's worse, the palace itself amplified the stench. Rushes strewn across the floors grew moldy with spilled ale, urine, and scraps of meat. Chamber pots were emptied into courtyards and moats, where waste festered in the sun. Kitchens stank of smoke and blood. The entire palace was a stew of odors, and your own body simply joined the chorus. Bathing wouldn't have saved you even if you could indulge in it. Clean skin would have been recontaminated within hours, but still, people clung to the fantasy. Queens were painted with glowing cheeks and radiant skin. Poets described their sweet fragrance, and visiting envoys recorded their impressions of elegance. None of them wrote about the stains on your bodice, the sweat trickling down your back, or the lice you felt crawling behind your ear during a feast. They wrote the lie, and the lie survived. The truth was less kind. Queens, draped in silk and brocade, stank just like everyone else. They were perfumed corpses in motion, bodies wrapped in wealth but rotting slowly beneath. Bathhouses were condemned. Soap was scarce. Water was feared. And perfume was the only mask you had. You could be crowned, anointed, worshipped by the court, but beneath the velvet you still smelled of sweat, grease, and despair. So, when history tells you that queens shimmered like angels and smelled of roses, don't believe it. They stank in silk, every bit as human and filthy as the peasants who emptied their chamber pots. And no amount of perfume could ever wash that away. Being queen gave you a crown, a throne, and a title that sounded powerful, but the reality was that you were little more than a pawn in a game you didn't control. Kings, bishops, and advisors shuffled you across the board like a piece of carved ivory, useful only for the alliances you secured, the heirs you produced, and the way your body could be leveraged as collateral in treaties written by men who would never bleed for them. Marriage wasn't romance. It wasn't partnership. It was politics in lace and velvet, and you were the bargaining chip dressed up to look like destiny. From the very beginning, your marriage wasn't yours to choose. You didn't marry because you fell in love with a knight at a tournament or because you were swept off your feet by poetry. You married because your father needed troops, because your brother needed land, because two kingdoms needed peace. You were the glue slathered over broken borders, and everyone expected you to hold fast no matter how sharp the cracks beneath you. If your new husband was old, cruel, or hideous, that was irrelevant. He was useful. If he already had mistresses or bastard children, that was irrelevant too. The ceremony wasn't about you. It was about power stitched together in Latin vows. And once the crown settled on your head, it didn't make you a player in this game. It only marked you more clearly as a piece. Kings had councils, advisors, generals. Queens had expectations. You smiled beside him at feasts, nodded in the right places during audiences, bore his children when commanded. If you ever dared step outside that narrow line, if you hinted that you might influence policy or voice dissent, you were met with the cold reminder that your authority came from him and could be stripped away just as easily. A king's anger could dismiss you to a convent or worse, and no one would blink. Even when you were consulted, it was rarely because anyone cared about your opinion. It was because your presence lent legitimacy. You were brought into councils like a piece of gilded furniture, meant to symbolize unity, while the real decisions took place in hushed conversations after you left. Your words were politely recorded and then quietly ignored. You could host banquets, commission tapestries, sponsor religious works, but the affairs of state, the wars, the treaties, the taxes, unfolded without your voice. You were told what had been decided after the ink was dry, expected to nod and support it publicly, as if you had been part of the process all along. And yet, the cruel irony was that your fate was always entangled in these politics. If the king lost a war, you bore the humiliation. If a treaty collapsed, you were blamed as a bad omen. If your husband's enemies gathered strength, you were accused of consorting with them, simply because you were born in another land. Queens were often foreign brides, shipped across borders to marry strangers, and the very blood in your veins became grounds for suspicion. To the court, you were always someone else's daughter, someone else's sister, a spy planted in their midst. You could smile, bear heirs, build churches, but you were never entirely theirs. That suspicion bred paranoia. You learned quickly to watch your words, to measure your glances, to stay quiet when courtiers baited you with questions about your homeland. A single misplaced phrase could spark rumors that you favored your old country over your new one. A single gift sent home to your family could be twisted into treason. Even your ladies-in-waiting, often chosen by others, might report back to factions eager to twist your actions into plots. You lived in a palace full of eyes, each pair watching for cracks, for signs of disloyalty, for the smallest misstep that could bring you down. And if the king died, your position collapsed with him. You might be mother to heirs, but until those sons grew old enough to rule, you were vulnerable. Regents and councils saw you as an obstacle, or, worse, as a rival. Some queens found themselves locked away in towers, accused of treason or immorality, conveniently removed so men could seize power. Others were forced into hasty remarriages, their bodies once again leveraged to tie up alliances like parcels on a trade route. Widowhood didn't bring freedom. It brought a new round of negotiations, a new set of men arguing over where you should be placed and whose ambitions you should serve next. Even success didn't guarantee safety. Say you bore sons, charmed the court, smiled through humiliation, and endured your husband's mistresses. Still, you could fall victim to shifting winds. A faction of nobles might rise against you, claiming you practiced sorcery. An ambitious bishop might whisper that your barrenness in certain years was divine punishment. Or a younger, prettier noblewoman might catch the king's eye, and suddenly your years of sacrifice meant nothing. Queens were replaceable. You were not a ruler but a role, and the moment you faltered, someone else was waiting in the wings to take it. That was the core of the cruelty. You were vital to the game, but never allowed to play it. Your marriage created alliances, but you couldn't negotiate them. Your children secured dynasties, but you had no say in their futures. Your body and your blood were weapons wielded by others, and you lived with a constant knowledge that your fate rested not in your own hands, but in the whims of men who saw you as a signature at the bottom of a treaty. The fairy tales tell us queens commanded kingdoms, ruled beside kings as equals, stood in golden halls dispensing justice. The reality was closer to imprisonment in a gilded cage. Every move dictated, every word weighed. Your crown balanced precariously on the shifting tides of politics you could never control. You weren't a queen in your own right. You were a pawn, decorated, displayed, and discarded when no longer useful. And the worst part was knowing that no matter how carefully you played your part, no matter how gracefully you endured the humiliation, your fate could still be decided by someone else's hand moving you across the board. You were always a piece in someone else's game, and queens, for all their crowns, were never the players. You might think the greatest enemy you'd face as a queen would be some foreign rival, a scheming noble, or your husband's wandering eye. But often, the deadliest threat sat just across the table at dinner, smiling sweetly while she sharpened her claws. The Queen Mother, the King's mother, your new mother-in-law, wasn't just family. She was a force of nature, and one that rarely worked in your favor. Queens came and went, after all. Wives could be set aside, humiliated, or replaced. But the king's mother? She was permanent, cemented in power by blood, experience, and the sheer force of survival. You were still learning how to walk the tightrope of court life. She had been dancing on it for decades. The Queen Mother knew the palace better than anyone. She knew which servant could be bribed, which bishop whispered in the king's ear, which noble families were just waiting to pounce on weakness. While you stumbled through ceremonies and tried not to faint under the weight of your gown, she was orchestrating plots with the precision of a general. And worse, she had leverage you could never match: her son. A king might tire of his wife. He never stopped being his mother's child. You could cry, beg, plead for favor, but in the end, your husband often chose the woman who raised him over the woman forced to marry him. The rivalry between queens and queen mothers wasn't just a matter of jealousy or bruised pride. It was survival. Court was a battlefield, and every scrap of power mattered. If you produced heirs, she saw them as her grandchildren. Blood she might try to shape against you. If you struggled to conceive, she whispered to the court about your failures, nodding with the weary authority of a woman who had clearly done her duty. If you tried to influence politics, she dismissed you as inexperienced and meddling, even while she pulled strings herself. There was no winning. Every move you made was either undermined or appropriated by the woman who had been queen before you, and who still, in many ways, remained queen now. And make no mistake, queen mothers could be vicious. Some acted as regents, ruling outright while their sons were still boys, and they did not easily step aside when those sons grew into men. They had tasted power and learned how to wield it, and they weren't about to let a teenage bride with no allies take it away. They had already outlived rivals, survived childbirth, and clawed their way into survival in a world that killed women casually. They weren't fragile dowagers sitting quietly in the background. They were predators, seasoned and ruthless, and you were often their prey. Even daily life in the palace was poisoned by her presence. At feasts she sat near the king, her laughter ringing louder than yours, her stories peppered with little barbs aimed squarely at you. At religious ceremonies she took the place of honor, her piety outshining yours no matter how long you knelt in prayer. Servants deferred to her, courtiers flattered her, and foreign envoys often sought her approval before yours. You were supposed to be the center of attention, the radiant consort of the king, but somehow you were always overshadowed by a woman whose crown had never slipped, not even when yours was still being fitted, and the court thrived on this rivalry. Every whispered insult, every frosty glance, every rumor of discord was fuel for gossip. Nobles chose sides, attaching themselves either to you or to her, and the factions could become dangerous. Some queens found themselves isolated, abandoned by courtiers who feared the queen mother's wrath more than they hoped for your favor. Others tried to ally with her, only to discover that an alliance with a woman like her was just a leash in disguise. She might praise you in public, only to undermine you in private, ensuring you never stood firmly enough to challenge her. The danger was not only political but physical. Court rivalries were brutal, and poison didn't discriminate between wine meant for one queen or another. A suspicious miscarriage, a sudden illness, a goblet swapped at the last second. These things happened often enough that no queen could ignore the possibility. To the court, your death might look like tragedy. To her, it looked like opportunity, a chance to tighten her grip, to secure her son's loyalty, to remove the inconvenient girl who threatened to dilute her influence. You could never truly relax in her presence. Every smile hid teeth, every kindness disguised calculation, and yet you had to pretend. Open hostility was dangerous, even suicidal. You couldn't challenge her without making yourself look ungrateful, rebellious, or treasonous. So you gritted your teeth and called her mother. You curtsied when she entered the room, kissed her hand, and let her kiss your cheek, even when her lips felt like a death sentence. You endured her advice, her criticism, her endless comparisons between her reign and yours. You wore the mask of a dutiful daughter-in-law while inside, every nerve screamed at the injustice of bowing to a woman who treated you like an interloper in your own home. Sometimes, if you were very lucky, the Queen Mother died before she could destroy you. But even then, her shadow lingered. She left behind factions loyal to her, children she had molded, and a legacy impossible to escape. You were compared to her constantly, weighed against her wisdom, her fertility, her piety. If she had been beloved, you suffered by contrast. If she had been hated, you suffered as her continuation. Death didn't end her hold on you, it immortalized it. The fairy tales never tell this part. They write about evil stepmothers, jealous older women plotting in the wings. But they don't tell you that those stories were rooted in real queens, real rivalries, real women who wielded knives with words and daggers with whispers. They don't tell you that the smiling matron at the king's side could make your life hell with nothing more than a raised eyebrow and a carefully placed rumor. Being queen wasn't just about surviving your husband or childbirth. It was about surviving the woman who had already worn your crown and wasn't ready to take it off. And sometimes, she was the most dangerous rival you would ever face. The palace was never silent. Even in the dead of night, When torches guttered low in their sconces and the corridors seemed empty, you could feel the whispers pressing against the walls like damp. That was the truth of being queen. Your world was made of secrets, and none of them belonged to you. Spies filled every corridor, slipped through every chamber, lingered at the foot of your bed, disguised as servants or ladies in waiting. Your closest attendants, the women who dressed you in the morning, who brushed out the lice from your hair, who held the basin when you vomited in pregnancy. Those same women might be feeding every intimate detail of your life to another lord, another bishop, another rival at court. You couldn't trust a smile. You couldn't trust a whispered oath. The very hands that laced your gown could just as easily have sealed your death. Every letter you wrote, every note you sent, was a risk. Paper carried power, and ink could undo you as easily as poison. Love letters, confessions, even harmless correspondence with your family back home were intercepted, opened, studied. Messengers were bribed, or threatened, or all too eager to slip an extra copy into the hands of your enemies. A single phrase, written hastily in frustration, could be twisted into proof of treason. If you dared complain about the king, the council might read your words aloud as evidence of rebellion. If you asked after your brothers or cousins across the border, it became proof that you plotted to aid foreign powers. Every line of ink became a potential rope around your neck. The paranoia crept into every part of your life. You couldn't even cough without wondering if someone would turn it into evidence. A lingering fever could be whispered into rumors of poisoning. A faint during Mass might be spun into tales of secret pregnancy or, worse, heresy. Your body betrayed you daily, and every weakness became an opening for enemies. Servants carried news of your pallor through the palace, courtiers added embellishments, and before long, your sickness was less an ailment and more a political storm. If you recovered, you might be accused of faking the whole thing for sympathy. If you didn't, you might never know whether your decline was nature's cruelty or someone's calculated plan. And poisoning was not a paranoid fantasy. It was a reality, a shadow always hovering at the edge of the goblet in your hand. Food tasters were assigned, unlucky souls forced to take the first bite of your bread, the first sip of your wine, the first nibble of a pear carved for your plate. If they lived, you could eat. If they faltered, if their lips went blue or their body seized on the rushes, you pushed your plate away with shaking hands and forced yourself to smile as though nothing were amiss. But tasting was not infallible. Some poisons killed slowly, others in doses small enough to sicken but not to slay outright. You could spend weeks wasting away, your belly twisting, your hair thinning, your mind clouded. And no one would ever be certain whether it was bad meat or an enemy's careful hand. This constant fear warped even the smallest gestures. When a servant poured your wine, you studied their hands for tremors. When a lady in waiting brushed your hair, you wondered whose chamber she'd visited before yours. When a bishop offered you the Eucharist, you hesitated before placing it on your tongue, aware that even the body of Christ could be laced with arsenic if your enemies were determined enough. Nothing was sacred, nothing was safe. It was worse because the court thrived on this atmosphere. Intrigue wasn't an accident. It was the currency of the realm. Nobles whispered half-truths into your ears to see how you'd react, then carried your responses elsewhere as proof of plots you'd never even considered. Servants angled for better positions by trading your secrets, real or imagined. Even your silence was interpreted, twisted, sold. You might sit at a banquet and say nothing, thinking you'd escaped notice, only to discover the next day that your quiet had been painted as sulking, disdain, or silent rebellion. At court, breathing was treason, if someone could profit from it, and through it all, you had to smile. To be visibly afraid was to look guilty. To show suspicion was to admit weakness. So you raised your goblet with steady hands, even as your stomach clenched. You wrote letters filled with meaningless pleasantries, hiding your true feelings so deeply that even you forgot them. You let your ladies braid your hair. even as their fingers trembled too long against your scalp, wondering if they lingered because of nerves or guilt. You performed serenity while drowning in suspicion, because queens who faltered were queens who fell. Sometimes, the poison wasn't even in the cup. It was in the rumors themselves. Whispers could kill as effectively as arsenic. A story told often enough about your supposed infidelity, your secret dealings with foreign kings, your whispered curses at mass, could be enough to have you imprisoned, annulled, even executed. The poison of words was slower, less dramatic, but every bit as fatal. And the worst part was that you could never trace the source. By the time the rumor reached your ears, it had passed through too many mouths, twisted beyond recognition. The court didn't care if it was true. The court cared that it was useful. So you learned to live half-starved, half-suffocated, your stomach tied in knots at every meal, your throat tight around every sip. You learned to lock your heart inside your chest, never daring to write what you truly felt, never trusting the friends who laughed at your side. You learned that the palace wasn't just stone walls and velvet draperies. It was a hive, buzzing with spies, humming with venom, feeding on the very fear that corroded you from within. Being queen wasn't about ruling. It was about surviving long enough to see another morning without the taste of poison on your tongue. It was about holding your head high while your insides twisted, while whispers slithered behind every door, while the very people lacing your gown might already be sharpening the knife for your back. And in the end, when you lifted the jeweled cup to your lips, you never really tasted wine. You tasted dread. A crown on your head didn't make you free. If anything, it put you in chains to yet another master, the church. Being queen meant being watched not only by courtiers and rivals, but by priests, bishops, and confessors who believed your soul was as much their property as your womb was the king's. You weren't allowed to simply exist as a woman who prayed or sinned like everyone else. You were expected to embody piety itself, to shine like a holy relic in human form, the perfect image of obedience, humility, and devotion. Every step, every gesture, every word you spoke in public was measured against the church's impossible standard. And if you faltered, if you prayed too little, or laughed too much, or failed to produce a son, your slip was interpreted not as human weakness, but as sin, heresy, or witchcraft. Religion suffused every moment of your day. You woke to prayers, whispered at your bedside. You crossed yourself before eating. You attended mass with the eyes of the court glued to your folded hands. You fasted when commanded, confessed when told, and donated to churches and monasteries to prove your devotion. Queens weren't allowed to display doubt. Doubt was dangerous. If you winced during Mass from back pain, it could be read as reluctance to honor God. If you wept too loudly in confession, people whispered about secret sins. If you didn't weep at all, they accused you of pride. Even your face was a battlefield, your piety written in its expressions for the court to dissect like scripture. And the churchmen never let you forget your role. Priests preached that women were weaker vessels, prone to temptation, saved only by obedience to men and by constant vigilance against their own corruption. You sat in the front pew while sermons dripped with venom about Eve, about Jezebel, about women who brought kingdoms to ruin with their sins. Every parable was a warning meant for you. Obey, endure, submit. If you tried to assert yourself, if you dared to voice an opinion that strayed from the church's line, it wasn't just insubordination. It was rebellion against God. The danger was never abstract. Fail to meet the church's expectations, and the accusations came swiftly. If you miscarried too often, it was not biology. It was punishment. If you struggled with infertility, whispers of God's wrath followed you from chapel to chapel. If you argued with your husband, murmurs of witchcraft crept through the corridors. Queens accused of sorcery weren't rare. Powerful women were convenient scapegoats, and a few whispered rumors could turn you from pious consort to dangerous heretic overnight. Charms to ease childbirth, herbal remedies for illness, even a fondness for astrology could be twisted into proof that you consorted with the devil. And unlike political rivals, the church had divine authority. An accusation from a priest didn't just threaten your reputation, it threatened your soul. But the cruelty lay in the double standard. Kings were allowed mistresses, drunkenness, cruelty, and wars that slaughtered thousands, and still they were painted as God's chosen rulers. A queen could falter once, skip a fast, laugh too freely, stumble in her devotions, and she was condemned as a sinner dragging the kingdom into peril. Your husband could defy the Pope himself and be called bold. You could whisper too long with a confessor and be branded dangerous. The church didn't see queens as rulers. They saw you as symbols, and symbols had to remain pure, no matter how much it cost the woman beneath the crown. Even acts of devotion were twisted into weapons. Endow a church and it was praised as generosity, but do it too often and courtiers sneered that you squandered money better spent on armies. Spend too much time in prayer, and you were called a saintly distraction, wasting energy that should go toward heirs. Spend too little, and you were accused of neglecting your soul. You lived in a world where you could not win, because no matter what you did, someone could interpret it as sin. And when the church interpreted your life, the consequences were permanent. Excommunication wasn't just social death, it was eternal damnation. The ultimate terror held over every queen's head. You could never forget the stakes, because religion painted itself across every part of your daily existence. Palaces had chapels in every wing. Bells rang at every hour. Priests hovered constantly with prayers on their lips and judgment in their eyes. Your crown itself was given not by your husband or your people, but by the church, in ceremonies drenched in oil and incense. It was their way of reminding you that your authority came from God only so long as you obeyed their rules. If you stepped outside them, the same priests who crowned you could just as easily damn you. Even motherhood, the one role that defined your queenship, was bound by religious scrutiny. Bear sons, and you were hailed as blessed by God. Bear only daughters or lose infants to sickness, and priests whispered that the Almighty was punishing your sins. Your labor pains were seen as Eve's curse, a reminder of women's inherent guilt. Even in childbirth, you couldn't escape the church's shadow. Your blood was not just your body breaking. It was a sermon made flesh. The church's grip was suffocating, but the real cruelty was how it infiltrated your own mind. After enough sermons, enough confessions, enough whispered warnings, you began to believe the accusations. Every headache felt like divine punishment. Every stillbirth seemed like God's judgment. You prayed harder, fasted longer, punished yourself with guilt until your body broke. Queens often became their own jailers, chaining themselves to the very standards that would eventually destroy them. The fairy tales show queens as resplendent figures crowned in gold, blessed by God, radiant with holiness. The truth was more merciless. You were not holy, you were human. But you were forced to live as if every human slip was proof that you were cursed. The church didn't just own your prayers, it owned your reputation, your marriage, your children, your soul. And no matter how many hours you knelt, no matter how many churches you built or alms you gave, you could never truly be safe. Because one accusation, one rumor, one unlucky misstep was all it took to turn you from God's chosen queen into his condemned sinner. Queens are supposed to sit on thrones, radiant and untouchable, issuing commands with a flick of the hand while servants scurry to obey. That's the fantasy anyway. The fairy tales sold in stories and paintings, where the queen's greatest labor is deciding which gown to wear. The reality was far less regal. Being queen didn't mean doing nothing. It meant doing everything, all the time, in 1,000 ways that exhausted you but granted no real power. Your life was a ceaseless parade of duties, ceremonies, obligations, and rituals that left you drained before the sun even set. You weren't allowed leisure, not really. Every waking hour belonged to someone else. Your mornings began with ritual. Rising wasn't private. It was performance. You were dressed by attendants who bowed and whispered while tugging you into another suffocating gown. Every movement, even the act of putting on shoes, was layered with symbolism. You weren't simply getting ready for the day. You were presenting yourself as the embodiment of dignity, piety, and authority. From the moment you opened your eyes, you were already working, and once you were dressed, your duties stretched endlessly in front of you. Prayers came first. Always prayers. Queens were expected to be holy women, models of devotion, the glittering proof that the crown sat under God's blessing. Mass was not optional, nor was confession, nor the constant presence at processions, vigils, and feast days. Your body might ache, your mind might wander, but you knelt anyway, hour after hour, lips moving and words you no longer felt. Religion was not just faith. It was labor, and you were a public exhibit of it, forced to perform your piety so others could judge whether the realm was pleasing to heaven. From prayer you moved to audiences, receiving nobles, ambassadors, and courtiers. You smiled until your cheeks burned, spoke gently even when you wanted to scream, accepted gifts, listened to endless chatter. Queens were expected to host with grace, to embody hospitality itself. You played mediator in feuds, nodded politely at complaints, and pretended to be delighted by tedious compliments. Refusing to play hostess wasn't an option. A cold or aloof queen bred resentment, and resentment was dangerous. So you spent your hours entertaining others, drinking watered wine you didn't want, laughing at jokes you'd heard 100 times, all while every word you spoke was noted, remembered, and twisted into political fodder. And then there were the ceremonies. Endless, mind-numbing ceremonies. Coronations, baptisms, weddings, funerals, feast days, saint days, tournaments, royal entries into towns. Each one required your presence, your smile, your jewels. You sat through hours of pomp, your body aching under layers of fabric, while priests droned on and nobles paraded past. It looked glorious to the crowd. To you, it was exhausting repetition, the same rituals performed over and over until they blurred together into a haze of incense smoke and stiff posture. Even the act of eating became labor. Banquets were staged, not for pleasure but for politics. You presided over long tables loaded with food you often couldn't stomach, maintaining perfect composure as music played, jesters cavorted, and courtiers jockeyed for your attention. You couldn't yawn, couldn't grimace, couldn't push away your plate, no matter how much your stomach churned. You were on display, an ornament in human form, and the audience expected nothing less than flawless performance. And when the ceremonies ended, your work continued. Queens were responsible for the moral and cultural life of the court. That meant overseeing your ladies-in-waiting, managing their marriages, serving as patroness of artists, musicians, and scholars, ensuring that your household radiated refinement. You commissioned tapestries not because you loved them, but because they proved your cultivation. You organized masks and pageants not for fun, but to reinforce dynastic propaganda. Every hobby was really duty. Every act of leisure, another obligation to reinforce the image of power you didn't actually wield. Your greatest chore, of course, was childbearing. The court expected you to be perpetually pregnant, your body a conveyor belt of heirs. That wasn't just personal labor, it was national duty. Every pregnancy, every birth, every christening was another performance, another round of expectation and judgment. Between pregnancies, you were supposed to resume the endless schedule of prayers, ceremonies, and hosting, even when your body was broken, even when grief hollowed you out from the loss of another child. There was no rest. Your womb was your work, and your work never stopped. The cruelty was how little all this labor mattered. You worked harder than anyone. Hours of prayer, days of ceremonies, years of childbearing. And yet none of it gave you real authority. You didn't pass laws. You didn't lead armies. You didn't decide policy. All of your work was invisible scaffolding, propping up the king's power while leaving you empty-handed. If you performed perfectly, people credited the king for his wisdom in marrying you. If you faltered, you alone bore the blame. Even in private, there was no reprieve. Letters had to be answered, always with grace, always with care. Every word was weighed, for fear that it could be read by eyes other than the recipient's. Your ladies needed guidance. Your children needed tutors. Your confessor demanded time. You might long to sit with embroidery or a book, but even those acts were political, judged for what they signified. Embroidery showed diligence and modesty. Reading could spark suspicion if the text was too bold. You could never simply be. You could only work, endlessly, at the labor of appearing the perfect queen. And when night came, you were still not free. Feasts, dances, and entertainments stretched into the small hours, and your presence was mandatory. You dragged yourself through the motions, smiling until your face ached, your mind numb from exhaustion. Finally, when you reached your chambers, even your bed was not a sanctuary. The king might summon you, whether you were ready or not, because your body was never your own. Sleep was fitful, brief, and filled with the dread of the next day's cycle. That was the reality of a queen's life. Not leisure, not authority, but endless labor disguised as privilege. You were the busiest person in the palace, your hours devoured by ceremonies, prayers, pregnancies, and hosting, and yet you remained powerless, a servant of image rather than a wielder of power. And when people looked at you, they didn't see the exhaustion, the sacrifice, the relentless grind. They saw a crown and assumed you lived in ease. Queens were never just wives. They were bargaining chips, tokens on a board too vast and merciless for them to control. To be born noble and female meant being raised with the knowledge that one day you might be traded across borders like a gilded package, sent into the arms of a stranger for the sake of peace. Your body was the ink on a treaty, your smile the currency of diplomacy, your womb the guarantee that two kingdoms would stop bleeding each other dry. You weren't chosen for who you were. You were chosen because your bloodline matched the requirements of the latest deal. And once the deal was made, you ceased to be a daughter of your homeland. You became a diplomatic meat shield. Imagine being 16, kissed goodbye by family you will never see again, and loaded into a carriage bound for a foreign land where every word is strange and every eye is suspicious. The journey is long, the farewells are final, and the air reeks of anxiety. You aren't traveling as yourself, you are traveling as a treaty. The letters you carry aren't love notes but instructions, reminders that your duty is not to your heart but to your king, your father, your country. You step across the border, and in that moment, you belong to someone else. Whatever warmth or pride you once had in your homeland becomes irrelevant. You are a gift to strangers, and gifts don't speak, they smile, and at first, you are celebrated. Your arrival is trumpeted with feasts, your wedding staged like a festival of unity. Nobles gather to gawk at you, whispering about your beauty, your dowry, your potential to bear heirs. They weigh you with their eyes, calculating not who you are, but what you can produce. And as you walk down the aisle beside your new husband, the crowd cheers not for love but for peace, or at least the temporary illusion of it. You are paraded as proof that war is over, though you know, deep inside, that wars never end because of a woman in a wedding veil. They only pause until swords are sharpened again. That pause is your burden. If peace holds, you will be praised for your grace and fertility. If it falters, if armies rise again, you will be blamed. Not the men who raised the levies or signed the orders. You. Queens bore the weight of failed alliances like millstones around their necks. If a treaty dissolved, whispers grew that you had been cold to your husband, that you had failed to bind him with affection. If a border skirmish reignited, people muttered that you had sent secret letters to your homeland, playing double agent. If your children died young, the peace you embodied was declared cursed. Your womb was expected to hold kingdoms together, and when it couldn't, the fracture was written into your flesh, and so you lived in constant fear, knowing you were only as secure as the alliance you symbolized. You watched the king's court with hawk eyes, searching for signs of discontent. You trained your smile until it was flawless, your words until they were harmless, your posture until it conveyed perfect submission. But no matter how carefully you played the part, you couldn't control the tides of war, the ambitions of men, the greed of nobles. You could only wait for the day when the fragile peace you embodied cracked, and everyone turned to you for blame. Worse still, you were always a foreigner. Queens married into foreign lands never fully belonged. Courtiers eyed you with suspicion, calling you the Spanish woman, the French woman, the German woman, never simply queen. Every gesture was questioned. Every gift you sent home was scrutinized. Speak too fondly of your homeland, and you were accused of treachery. Distance yourself from it, and you were accused of ingratitude. You balanced on a knife edge, never trusted, always watched, belonging nowhere except in the narrow role of symbol. And you weren't safe, even at home. Should war break out, you could become the perfect scapegoat. Queens accused of treason were not rare. A whisper that you had passed secrets to your homeland was enough to ruin you. A letter intercepted, a rumor overheard, and suddenly you weren't a queen at all. You were a spy in velvet. Courts were littered with women condemned on flimsy evidence, locked away in convents, or executed outright when the peace their bodies had been meant to guarantee dissolved into violence. Yet, through all of this, you were expected to remain serene. You were the face of diplomacy, the human veil covering the machinery of war. You kissed children at festivals, blessed pilgrims, and attended Mass as though God himself were watching to see if you would uphold the fragile threads of peace. You performed endlessly, never letting the fear show, because once you cracked, the mask slipped, and with it, the illusion that your presence alone could prevent kingdoms from collapsing into bloodshed. The irony was that your very passivity was your greatest weapon. You weren't expected to command armies or negotiate treaties. You were expected to exist, to smile, to produce heirs, to be beautiful enough, pious enough, docile enough, to keep men convinced that peace was possible. You were a living placeholder, a fragile shield placed between two sharpened swords. And when that shield splintered, the swords didn't stop to mourn. They simply cut through you on their way to each other. History remembers treaties, kings, and battles. It rarely remembers the queens shipped across borders like exotic livestock, dressed in silks that reeked of sweat and fear, and forced to hold together nations with nothing more than their bodies. You weren't a player in the game. You were the token, carried from one hand to another until you broke. And when you broke, peace broke with you. Being queen meant that your life was shackled to the crown, and if the man wearing it happened to be a fool, you bore the consequences. You didn't get to shrug and say, well, that's his problem. His failures were your failures. His blunders stained you, as surely as they weakened the realm. And yet, you couldn't criticize him, couldn't openly correct him, couldn't even raise your voice when his drunken schemes or petty tantrums pushed the kingdom toward disaster. The king's incompetence became your private burden, and you cleaned up the mess in silence. Because if you didn't, you risked being blamed as the cause or punished for daring to show the truth. The incompetence came in many forms. Maybe he was cowardly, too terrified of battle to face his enemies, yet too proud to admit it. Maybe he was cruel, delighting in executions or taxes that drove his people into rebellion. Maybe he was simply lazy, preferring the company of hunting dogs and mistresses to the grind of governance. Whatever his particular brand of failure, It was your daily reality. You watched him stagger into council reeking of wine, or ignore ambassadors in favor of dice games, or plunge the realm into debt with lavish feasts meant to disguise his inadequacies. Every mistake he made rippled outward, destabilizing the fragile balance of court and kingdom. And each ripple reached you, because when the people grumbled, it wasn't just about him. They grumbled about you too. Queens were expected to be moral anchors, symbols of restraint and wisdom. If the king gambled away the treasury, whispers said you encouraged his excess. If he waged a disastrous war, rumors claimed you had whispered the idea into his ear. If he neglected his duties, critics accused you of distracting him with vanity or witchcraft. You weren't only chained to his bed, you were chained to his reputation, and every time he dragged it through the muck, you were splattered with it. So you learned the art of cleaning quietly. When he ignored petitions, you listened to them in private and passed word to sympathetic advisors. When he lavished gifts on his mistresses, you ensured the slighted nobles received tokens from you, small enough to soothe but not so grand as to spark his wrath. When he abandoned councils, you gathered scraps of information from ministers and hinted at compromises to keep disaster at bay. You couldn't rule openly. Queens who seized power were accused of ambition or treason, but you could smooth edges, patch cracks, slow the kingdom's bleeding without anyone realizing you were the one holding it together. The danger was in being too successful. If you corrected him too effectively, people noticed, and when they noticed, they whispered. The queen rules in his place. The king is her puppet. Such whispers were daggers. Men did not tolerate the idea of being ruled by a woman, even indirectly. A queen who was too competent became a threat, not a savior. The more you cleaned, the closer you crept to the edge of a blade. And make no mistake, that blade was real. Incompetent kings were often paranoid, terrified that others might expose their weakness. They lashed out at the very people trying to protect them. A single word of advice, if delivered at the wrong moment, could be twisted into insult or rebellion. Correct him in public, and you risked humiliation at best, banishment at worst. Even in private, you had to measure every syllable, couching suggestions as flattery, masking corrections as admiration. Your survival depended on your ability to make him believe his ideas had been his all along. You didn't just manage a kingdom. You managed his ego, endlessly, carefully, like cradling a viper you couldn't release. And when he failed so spectacularly that no amount of soft words could disguise it, when he lost wars, squandered alliances, or collapsed into scandal, you had two choices: endure the humiliation in silence, or risk sharing his downfall. Queens were rarely spared when kings collapsed. If rebellion rose, if foreign powers invaded, if famine spread, the people blamed both thrones, not just one. You became a target for their rage, a scapegoat for their suffering. A starving peasant didn't care that you hadn't set the tax rate. They saw velvet gowns and imagined complicity. When kings drowned, queens were dragged under with them. And yet, there were times when a queen's quiet work was the only thread holding the kingdom together. History rarely records those efforts because they were meant to be invisible. No chronicler praised the queen who soothed a furious noble after the king insulted him. No poet sang of the queen who slipped gold to keep mercenaries from defecting when her husband forgot to pay them. No monk recorded the nights you stayed awake negotiating between factions while the king snored in drunken oblivion. These labors vanished into silence, absorbed by the myth of the king's authority. He reaped the glory when things went well, and you shouldered the blame when they didn't. There was a special kind of despair in knowing that you could be destroyed either way. If you failed to fix his mistakes, you were doomed by association. If you succeeded, you risked being accused of overstepping. You walked a line so thin it barely existed, balancing endlessly, praying that the weight of his incompetence wouldn't tip you both into ruin. And because you couldn't admit any of this aloud, you carried the dread alone. You smiled through banquets where he slurred his words. You held your head high when ambassadors mocked him behind fans. You endured the laughter of courtiers who knew exactly how unfit he was. You wore serenity like armor, even as exhaustion hollowed you out. In fairy tales, the incompetent king is a figure of comedy, a bumbling fool made harmless by his crown. In reality, his failures were lethal, and the queen's role was never funny. It was endless labor, endless vigilance, endless risk. You lived every day knowing that your life was tethered to a man who might undo you with his weakness, and that your only weapon was the quiet, thankless work of saving him from himself. And when you looked into the mirror at night, stripped of jewels and gowns, you saw the cruel truth reflected back. You weren't just his wife. You were his shield, his nursemaid, his scapegoat, his silent shadow cleaning blood from the floor he had spilled. You were the queen of nothing, except his incompetence. It didn't take much to be called a witch, a whisper, a miscarriage, a feud with the wrong noble family. Suddenly, the queen's perfume was no longer sweet. It was a potion. Her jewelry wasn't decoration. It was a talisman. Her silence wasn't dignity. It was scheming. Queens who dared to wield influence, who dared to speak with authority, who dared to survive in a court that wanted them docile and invisible, often found themselves branded not as wise or capable, but as sorceresses. Witchcraft was the most convenient label for a woman who frightened men. You could spend years performing piety, fasting on holy days, kneeling until your knees went numb, and still it only took one rumor to unravel it all. Perhaps you wore a pendant inscribed with foreign script. Suddenly it was no longer a gift from your mother. It was a charm to summon demons. Perhaps you favored certain herbs in your chamber to mask the stench of the palace. Those herbs became ingredients in a cauldron, whispered about in shadows. Perhaps you were simply too clever in counsel, too quick to answer, too bold in suggestion. Too your intelligence was unnatural, they decided, bought at the price of a pact with the devil. The accusation didn't need proof. Proof was the last thing it needed, and if you were unlucky enough to be foreign-born, suspicion followed you like smoke. A Spanish queen carried the shadow of Moorish sorcery. A French queen was accused of importing poisons. An Italian queen was said to dabble in alchemy. Your accent, your manners, your foreign fashions, all were evidence in the minds of courtiers eager to paint you as dangerous. You were already an outsider. To accuse you of witchcraft was to explain why you didn't quite fit, why the air around you seemed strange, why your presence unsettled them. The charges often circled your body most of all, because your body was the battleground of the kingdom. Fail to produce a son, and suddenly you were accused of cursing your own womb. Too many miscarriages in a row, and they said you had offended God or invited the devil into your bedchamber. If your husband was impotent, the blame shifted to you. Obviously, you had bewitched him, drained his strength, stolen his virility. No man could simply be weak or sick. It was easier to imagine his wife had poisoned his seed. The sheets of your marriage bed became exhibits in a case built on paranoia. Your very fertility weighed as evidence of sorcery, and the more powerful you appeared, the more the rumors sharpened. Queens who played the meek consort, who smiled and embroidered and remained silent, were rarely accused. But queens who grasped at politics, who built factions, who dared to command loyalty, those were the ones transformed into witches in the popular imagination. Their successes became unnatural, their influence a sign of black magic. How else could a woman wield power, if not through dark arts? It was easier to believe that you whispered spells in the dark than that you were simply smarter than the men around you. The stories spread like wildfire, and once they spread, they stuck. A noble who had lost favor with you would mutter that you cursed his crops. A rival at court would point to your jewels and claim they glowed at night. A priest unhappy with your piety would suggest you were too close to demons. Soon every illness, every unlucky death, every sudden storm was pinned on you. A horse collapsed in the stables. Your fault. A ship sank at sea. You willed it. A child choked on bread. Block. In your hex. You became the kingdom's scapegoat, a vessel to hold all the fears and failures no one wanted to admit were their own. Some queens leaned into it, at least in rumor. Tales grew of women who kept books of spells hidden in their chambers, who brewed potions for beauty, who dosed rivals with subtle poisons disguised as medicine. Whether or not they did, the accusations alone were enough to burn their names into infamy. You could live a life of ordinary suffering, ordinary labor, and still be remembered only as the sorceress who supposedly dabbled in charms. History delights in a wicked queen, and witchcraft was the perfect brush to paint her with. The cruelest part was that you could not defend yourself. To deny the charge was to dignify it. To laugh at it was to risk seeming flippant. To fight it was to look guilty. Silence was safest, but silence never saved anyone. Once the word witch attached itself to your crown, it grew like mold, impossible to scrub away. And even if you escaped trial or execution, the stain lingered. You might live out your days in prayer, but you would still be remembered for the whisper of spells on your lips, not the rosary in your hands. A queen accused of witchcraft lived in constant dread, not only of the mob, who could be whipped into frenzy with a single sermon, but of her own court, which used the accusation as a weapon. Your enemies could box you into a corner with nothing more than rumor. Your allies could desert you overnight, too afraid of being painted with the same brush. Even your husband, the king you were supposed to support and obey, could be turned against you by whispers that you had ensnared him. Love didn't stand a chance against the terror of enchantment. Better for him to kill you than to admit weakness. Fairy tales dress these women in black cloaks, set them cackling over cauldrons, make them villains to be defeated by shining knights. But the reality was crueler. These witches were queens, trapped in courts that couldn't tolerate their power, women whose ambition or intelligence or sheer bad luck made them convenient targets. They weren't villains. They were victims of fear, dressed up as piety, of politics masked as morality. And the tragedy is that once the accusation was made, it didn't matter whether you had ever touched an herb, whispered a charm, or prayed to the wrong saint. The word itself was enough. One word could destroy you, strip you of crown and dignity, leave you broken in a convent or buried in disgrace. That was the peril of being a queen who dared to behave badly, or simply dared to behave at all. One rumor of witchcraft, and you weren't a woman anymore. You were a monster, and monsters don't get mercy. Queens were supposed to embody perfection, but the rules of that perfection were a trap with no escape. If you were plain or quiet, the court dismissed you as weak, pitiable, unworthy of notice. But if you happened to be beautiful and clever, the narrative twisted into something far darker. Suddenly, you weren't admired. You were dangerous. You became the seductress, the femme fatale, the woman whose charm threatened to topple kingdoms. Every smile was spun into manipulation, every word into entrapment, every gesture into proof that you wielded sorcery between your eyelashes. Queens couldn't win, because the world didn't allow powerful women to simply exist. You were either invisible or poisonous. The myth of the dangerous seductress was more useful to men than the truth. It explained away their own weakness, their own hunger, their own failures. If a king fell into ruin, it wasn't because he was incompetent or reckless. It was because his queen bewitched him. If a nobleman betrayed his oath, it wasn't because of ambition. It was because the queen's beauty lured him into sin. Your face, your body, your wit became weapons in their stories, and you weren't allowed to deny it. Denial itself became suspicious. The more you protested, the more they nodded knowingly, whispering that you had fooled them all. You could feel the eyes on you in every chamber, every hall. Courtiers dissected your appearance like surgeons. Was your gown too fine? Proof you were vain and manipulative. Was your laugh too loud? Evidence of shamelessness. Did you speak too often in council? Clearly, you were ensnaring men with your cunning. Did you remain silent? Clearly, you were plotting in shadows. Even your body was a prison. To be beautiful was to be accused of wielding beauty as a weapon. To be clever was to be accused of hiding daggers in your words. The danger of this myth was that it wasn't just gossip. It was political dynamite. Rivals used it to undermine your influence, to argue that your opinions in council weren't reasoned but seductive, that your husband wasn't persuaded but bewitched. If the king listened to you, it was never because you were wise. It was because you had poisoned him with charm. If ambassadors left impressed, it wasn't diplomacy. It was your wicked allure. The femme fatale myth robbed you of credit for your intelligence and simultaneously punished you for having it. You weren't allowed to be smart without being accused of corruption, and yet you couldn't play dumb. A queen who was silent, who never offered counsel, who shrank into the background, was considered useless. Nobles dismissed her as a waste of crown and gown. The church condemned her as negligent of her role as moral compass. The people mocked her for having no influence. You were expected to guide, but never lead, to inspire, but never command. The line between too little and too much was so thin it could slice you in half. What made it worse was how easily the myth seeped into stories that outlived you. Chronicles written by monks, plays performed for generations, ballads sung by minstrels. They all loved the image of the queen who destroyed men with her beauty. These stories lived longer than you did. Your children might forget the sound of your voice, but history would remember you as a temptress, a schemer, a Jezebel. Even queens who spent their lives holding kingdoms together were remembered not for their work, but for rumors of their dangerous charm. It didn't matter whether you were actually unfaithful, whether you actually plotted, whether you ever so much as looked at another man. The myth needed no truth. It only needed whispers, and whispers were always abundant in the palace. Did you linger too long in conversation with a courtier? Evidence of seduction. Did you commission a poem or a song? Evidence of romantic corruption. Did you smile across the table? Evidence of plotting. The court didn't need facts. It only needed a story that turned your strength into sin. And the consequences were not just reputational, they were fatal. Queens accused of being femme fatales often found themselves cornered into trials, exiled, or even executed. A beautiful smile could be recast as proof of adultery. A quick mind could be turned into evidence of conspiracy. Men who felt threatened by you didn't need to prove guilt. They only needed to convince others that you had used your body as a weapon, and suddenly you weren't a queen anymore. You were a harlot, a witch, a danger to the realm. Some queens tried to wield the myth to their advantage, leaning into it just enough to command fear, just enough to make men second-guess themselves. But even that was dangerous, because power born of suspicion was fragile. The same charm that protected you today could condemn you tomorrow. You could use allure as armor, but the sword it attracted was always sharper. One slip, one shift in fortune, one rival louder than the rest, and the armor cracked. The tragedy was that the myth wasn't about you at all. It was about fear of women who couldn't be controlled, who couldn't be silenced, who couldn't be confined to the role of docile wife and obedient mother. By turning queens into femme fatales, men made themselves victims of your supposed seduction, even as they remained the ones with the armies, the councils, the crowns. It allowed them to strip you of power while blaming you for wielding it. You became both scapegoat and monster, your cleverness rewritten as corruption, your beauty turned into proof of guilt. Fairy tales tell us queens were evil stepmothers, wicked enchantresses, seductresses who brought ruin. The truth is simpler and sadder. They were women who tried to exist within a system designed to destroy them, caught in a double bind where silence was weakness and speech was witchcraft. You could never be just a queen. You could only ever be an image projected by others, and the image most loved was the dangerous woman, the femme fatale who lured men to their doom. And so, whether you whispered or shouted, smiled or frowned, loved or loathed, your fate was already written. You were not a person in their eyes. You were a myth in flesh, and myths are always punished. Court was never a sanctuary. It was a stage, a battlefield, and a carnival of cruelty all at once, where every smile masked a blade and every bow hid a sneer. As queen, you weren't surrounded by friends. You were surrounded by predators, each of them circling, watching, waiting for the moment you faltered. Rival queens from other lands, mistresses flaunting their favor, ambitious nobles nursing grudges. These weren't distant threats. They were the people you dined with, prayed with, and passed in the corridors every day. Court was built on backstabbing, and your humiliation was its favorite entertainment. At first, it might look like camaraderie, laughter at feasts, compliments on gowns, a friendly hand offered as you rose from your seat. But you learned quickly that every gesture was calculated. That noblewoman who praised your embroidery would later whisper that you neglected your prayers to sew. That lady-in-waiting who smiled as she arranged your jewels might be reporting every word you spoke to a rival faction. That mistress who curtsied sweetly in public would make sure gossip about your barrenness was passed to every ear in private. Affection was currency, and everyone spent it with an eye to their own profit. Mistresses were the most brazen enemies of all, because they didn't need to hide. The king's infidelity wasn't shameful. It was expected, practically a perk of the crown. His mistresses strutted through the palace draped in silks you couldn't refuse them, boasting of jewels he had pressed into their hands, smirking at the way his eyes lingered on them even when you sat beside him. Some of them were clever enough to feign loyalty, to flatter you while stealing your influence. Others didn't bother. They paraded their triumphs, reminding you with every glance that while you might wear the crown, they had the king's ear, and often his heart. You couldn't retaliate without seeming jealous, petty, or cruel, and so you endured, smiling stiffly while your rivals grew fat on your humiliation. But mistresses weren't your only enemies. Nobles themselves often resented you, particularly if you were foreign-born. They sneered at your accent, mocked your fashions, and questioned your loyalty. They pitted you against one another, like pawns in their endless factional games. One group courted your favor, urging you to support their schemes, while another whispered that you were meddling too much, that your hand in politics proved you were dangerous. You were baited, cornered, tested. If you trusted too easily, you looked naive. If you withheld trust, you looked arrogant. Either way, someone profited from your discomfort. And sometimes, the worst rivals were the ones seated beside you. Other queens, other royal women, other wives of powerful men. Each one jockeyed for position, each one eager to prove her superiority. If you bore only daughters while another bore sons, she won the silent contest. If your gowns lacked sparkle compared to hers, you became the object of mockery. Even a smile too broad or too subdued could become a weapon, evidence that you were insecure or cold. These women knew exactly how hard it was to survive, and yet survival made them harder, not kinder. Pity was a luxury no one could afford. The palace ran on gossip, and gossip was sharpened deliberately. Every stumble became a story, every misstep a scandal. If you tripped at mass, someone said you were drunk. If you fainted, you were pregnant, or barren, or bewitched. If you lingered too long in conversation with a courtier, you were accused of adultery. Lies didn't need to be believable. They just needed to be repeated, whispered from chamber to chamber, until they clung to you like a stain. The courtiers thrived on it. Your life was their entertainment, and the crueler the tale, the better it tasted, and you couldn't escape it. Every day, You dressed in your silks, pinned on your jewels, and walked into the hall, knowing that every person you greeted might be your enemy. You learned to laugh at jokes that cut you to the bone, to exchange pleasantries with women who would gladly see you ruined, to accept compliments from men who plotted your downfall. You performed civility while your stomach turned, because refusing to play the game was more dangerous than playing it badly. Queens didn't get to sulk in corners. Queens smiled through poison. Even your allies weren't safe to trust. A loyal friend could be turned overnight, bribed with land, titles, or promises of favor. That lady-in-waiting who once swore her life to you might be whispering in your rival's chamber the next evening. Loyalty was as fragile as glass, and betrayal was the currency of the palace. You learned to guard your words, to guard your expressions, to guard even your silences, because anything could be twisted and sold. In time, you stopped expecting sincerity at all. What made it unbearable was how much they relished your pain. Court wasn't merely indifferent to your struggles, it delighted in them. A queen's humiliation was spectacle, her sorrow the punchline to a joke passed between goblets of wine. Your enemies savored every falter, every tear. And because you could not strike back, your misery became the safest form of entertainment. You were trapped in a theater where the role of victim was written for you, and the audience demanded endless encores. Fairy tales tell us that queens were cruel to others, but the truth is that the cruelty often closed in around them. The palace was a nest of vipers, each one striking for advantage, each one sinking its teeth into you while smiling as though in worship. You were never safe, never supported, never truly loved. You were surrounded by frenemies, rivals dressed as companions, mistresses dressed as ladies, courtiers dressed as allies. And through it all, you kept smiling, because to stop smiling was to admit defeat. To show pain was to feed the wolves. To lash out was to give them a reason to tear you apart. So you played the game, endured the backstabbing, and bore the laughter like armor. But the truth was brutal. Queens didn't sit in palaces surrounded by loyal subjects. They sat in cages filled with enemies, and every day was a battle just to keep breathing. The moment your husband dies, the crown doesn't fall into your hands. It slips past you, landing squarely on the head of the next man in line. And in that instant, whatever scraps of power or safety you once held vanish. You don't become queen in your own right. You become a widow. And widowhood in a palace isn't freedom. It's a trap. At first, there are the rituals of mourning. You're draped in black, veiled in layers of cloth so heavy you can barely see, paraded through cathedrals with tears smeared across your face. Courtiers watch you closely, weighing the sincerity of your grief as if your future depends on the performance. Because in truth, it does. Weep too little and you're callous, eager to rush into the arms of another man. Weep too much and you're hysterical, unfit to guide your children or advise in counsel. Even mourning becomes political theater, your sorrow measured in the rise and fall of your shoulders. But once the bells stop tolling and the prayers are whispered, reality sets in. Your husband is gone, and the throne now belongs to another man. Often your son if you're fortunate, but just as often a brother-in-law, a cousin, or some distant relative with more soldiers than sympathy. Whoever he is, he holds your future in his hands. Will you be honored as the Dowager Queen, respected for your years of service? Or will you be pushed aside, shipped to a convent, or forced into a second marriage designed to seal yet another alliance? You don't get to choose. The decision is his, and you wait like a prisoner for your sentence. Even when it is your son who inherits, your position isn't secure. A boy king means you might act as regent, but regency is a poisoned chalice. Nobles eye you hungrily, eager to snatch power from your hands, accusing you of corruption or manipulation the moment you make a decision. If you cling too tightly, you're branded ambitious, a Jezebel corrupting your child's reign. If you step back, you're irrelevant, stripped of influence while others raise your children into men who see you as an obstacle. not a mother. Your maternal bond is never protection. It's ammunition, twisted into accusations that you rule through sorcery or seduction. If your son is grown when his father dies, you face another cruelty. The boy you raised becomes the man who rules over you. He is no longer your child. He is your king, and he decides where you live, what you do, how much money you receive. Some sons honor their mothers with estates and titles. Others see them as inconvenient relics, reminders of a father they want to surpass. You can find yourself banished to some damp castle at the edge of the realm, left to wither in obscurity while your son listens to new favorites who despise you. You're no longer the center of the court. You're an afterthought, kept alive out of duty but denied dignity. And if it isn't your son but a brother-in-law who inherits, your danger multiplies. You are a symbol of the old king, of his alliances, his loyalties, his debts. That makes you both valuable and expendable. A new king may marry you off again, sending you to a foreign land like a parcel rewrapped and sent back through the trade routes. He may accuse you of treason to neutralize your influence, or he may simply confine you, ensuring you pose no threat to his new order. You become a piece of baggage from the last reign, too visible to ignore but too risky to leave unchecked. The widow's trap is that you are always vulnerable. No matter how many sons you bore, no matter how loyal you were, no matter how diligently you prayed, your fate is bound to the whims of the living king. You cannot govern your own lands without permission. You cannot choose where to live. You cannot even decide how long you'll mourn. You may still wear a crown, but it sits loosely, ornamental, and stripped of teeth. You are expected to embody dignity without having any power left to protect yourself. And the court, as always, feasts on your weakness. Rivals who once feared you now circle like wolves, no longer threatened by your husband's protection. Your ladies-in-waiting drift toward fresher centers of power. Ambitious nobles test your defenses, probing for signs of influence or vulnerability. Even the church watches, eager to claim you for a convent if your presence grows inconvenient. Widowhood does not free you from politics. It throws you into the most perilous version of it, where you must survive with fewer weapons than ever. The cruel irony is that death doesn't end your performance. Even as grief hollows you out, you must continue to play the role of queen. You must smile at the coronation of the new king, your own displacement unfolding in front of the entire court. You must endure the whispered comparisons between your late husband and his successor. You must watch as your rooms, your influence, your very presence in the palace are reduced while someone else takes center stage. You are alive, but already obsolete. Fairy tales like to imagine that widowed queens retreat into dignity, living peacefully in stately halls, guiding their sons with wisdom. The truth was colder. A widowed queen was a political liability, her very existence a reminder that crowns pass from one head to another, that women are never meant to rule, but only to serve as vessels. You could spend decades surviving childbirth, court intrigue, betrayal, and humiliation, only to find yourself caged in widowhood, powerless to shape your own ending. And that was the real trap. Widowhood wasn't an escape. It was another kind of captivity, one where your body was no longer useful but your presence was still dangerous. You weren't a queen anymore. You weren't even truly a woman in their eyes. You were a problem to be solved, a shadow to be contained, a relic to be silenced. The throne had never been yours. Widowhood only made that fact undeniable. Queens were supposed to live and die surrounded by velvet and gold, remembered in portraits and chronicles, their names echoing through history. But for many, the crown ended not in glory, but in chains. When a queen was no longer useful, when she failed to bear sons, when she lost her husband's favor, when her influence threatened the wrong faction, she was not permitted to fade gracefully into obscurity. She was locked away. A queen could be caged as easily as a common thief, her jewels stripped, her courtiers scattered, her name buried in silence. The prison queen was a figure history rarely sings about, because there is no glamour in a woman shivering in a tower. Imprisonment could begin abruptly, almost theatrically. One day you were dining at a gilded table, your cup filled with wine and your gown trailing brocade, and the next you were escorted from the hall by guards who did not meet your eyes. The excuses varied. Some queens were accused of treason, others of adultery, others simply of being unlucky enough to stand in the way of a king who wanted a new bride. The trial, if there was one, was a performance staged to justify the sentence. Guilt was assumed, and innocence was irrelevant. Once the decision was made, you were stripped of dignity and sent to confinement. The confinement itself was a cruel parody of royalty. You might be locked in a damp stone tower, the wind cutting through cracks in the walls, the rushes on the floor molding beneath your feet. Or you might be confined to a castle wing, its rooms barred, your movements tracked by guards more jailers than servants. The conditions depended on how hated or feared you were. Some queens were allowed a small retinue, ladies and priests to attend them, but others were left almost entirely alone. Meals were meager, sometimes deliberately spoiled, as though to remind you daily that you were no longer dining as a queen but surviving as a prisoner. Hunger gnawed away at your body, and cold gnawed away at your spirit. Isolation was its own torment. Once, every word you spoke had been echoed through the halls, carried to ears across the kingdom. Now, silence pressed in until it felt like a second set of chains. Letters you wrote were intercepted, censored, or never delivered. Visits from family were rare or forbidden altogether. Even your children, once your reason to endure, could be withheld from you, raised by others while you sat in a cell, imagining their faces hardening into strangers. The greatest cruelty was not knowing what was said about you in the world beyond your walls. Were you still remembered? Were you already forgotten? And yet, even in confinement, you remained dangerous in the eyes of those who had put you there. Your very existence was a threat. If you were alive, you could be rescued. If you had a name, it could be used to rally opposition. So, you were watched constantly, not because they feared your escape, but because they feared your survival. Guards lingered outside your chamber, listening to your coughs, counting your footsteps. Priests reported on your confessions. Servants, if you had any left, whispered every detail of your misery to those who paid them. You were a queen without a court, but still treated like a rival sovereign who had to be contained. Some queens languished for years this way, their beauty fading in the dark, their health crumbling under neglect. Starvation diets weakened their bodies, leaving them too frail to walk. Cold stone walls bruised their skin, damp floors inflamed their joints. Illness went untreated, pain ignored, death was often slow. A decline measured not in battles lost, but in the gradual extinguishing of strength. And when death finally came, it was usually quiet, unnoticed by the very people who had once clamored for your presence. A queen might die in her cell with no crown, no courtiers, no record, except a single line in an account book noting the cost of her burial shroud. Others met harsher ends. Imprisonment could be a prelude to execution, the tower only a waiting room for the axe or the pyre. The same crowd that once cheered your coronation might gather again to jeer your fall, watching as you were led to the block, your body shaking under the weight of their hatred. Execution was the final humiliation, proof that even queens could be erased like criminals. But in some ways, it was kinder than the endless years of slow decay. At least execution ended the waiting. What makes this fate even crueler is how quickly the world moved on. A new queen was crowned, her gowns gleaming, her fertility praised, her piety extolled. Your name was scrubbed from prayers, your likeness painted over, your memory deliberately dimmed. The woman who once embodied the very image of majesty was reduced to rumor, a cautionary tale whispered in corridors. You were not remembered as a person, but as a warning. What happens when a queen ceases to be useful? Fairy tales never tell this part. They end with queens triumphant or wicked, but always visible. They never show the silence of the tower, the cold of exile, the loneliness of a woman who once commanded respect and now counted rats as company. But for many, this was the final reality of queenship. Not crowns and courts, but confinement. Not power, but erasure. The prison queen was the kingdom's discarded relic, once precious, now abandoned. And though she sat in shadow, far from the glitter of the throne, her story was perhaps the truest of all, that a crown protected nothing, not even the woman who wore it. Being queen was never permanent. Your crown didn't belong to you. It belonged to your husband, to the church, to the nobles, to whoever found your existence useful. And once you stopped being useful, there were only two exits: divorce or death. Both were humiliating, both were cruel, and both reduced a woman who had once been paraded through cathedrals and cheered by crowds into a cautionary tale whispered in corridors. You could spend years breaking your body in childbirth, bowing through endless ceremonies, praying until your knees split open, and it still wasn't enough to guarantee survival. The truth was brutal. Queens were disposable. Divorce, of course, was rarely called divorce. It was annulment, a neat little fiction to erase not just your marriage, but your very existence as queen. Suddenly, the vows you had spoken in front of bishops, the blessings sanctified at altars, the decades of shared children, all of it was declared invalid, as though it had never happened. Your marriage was reduced to a clerical error, a mistake corrected by churchmen with quills and seals, and you were reduced to nothing. No longer queen, no longer wife, no longer mother in the eyes of law. Only a woman shuffled off to some convent or manor house to live out her days in humiliation. The public called it mercy. You knew it for what it was: erasure. Sometimes annulments came draped in piety. Perhaps your husband claimed you were too closely related, the marriage sinful from the start. Perhaps he argued that you had never truly consummated the union, painting you as a frigid failure. Perhaps he simply decided God had cursed your womb and that the kingdom's survival demanded a new wife. Whatever the excuse, it always ended the same way. You stripped of dignity, while the king posed as a man reluctantly forced to act for the good of his people. The court wept crocodile tears for your fall, but everyone knew the truth. A younger, prettier bride was already waiting in the wings, and if annulment was humiliation, execution was annihilation. The most infamous stories remind us of queens marched to scaffolds, their gowns clinging to trembling bodies, their lips whispering prayers as blades glittered in the sun. Anne Boleyn is remembered most vividly, but she was not alone. Queens accused of adultery, treason, witchcraft, always convenient charges, always impossible to disprove, were led to the block with the same inevitability as cattle to slaughter. Trials were theater, guilt a foregone conclusion. The audience was not there to weigh justice, but to revel in the spectacle of a queen undone. Execution was never just about punishment. It was performance, the final act in a play written to remind everyone that even crowns could not protect women. The queen who once glided through palaces became an object lesson, her downfall a story to keep others obedient. The sharp crack of the axe or the hiss of the sword wasn't just her end. It was a warning that wives, even royal wives, could be silenced permanently if they threatened to outgrow their roles. The charges themselves were always crafted to maximize shame. Adultery was a favorite, not because it was provable, but because it destroyed a queen's reputation even in death. To accuse a woman of betraying her husband's bed was to strip her of dignity, motherhood, and piety all at once. Witchcraft and treason were equally convenient, casting her not just as a failed wife but as an enemy of God and country. Evidence was irrelevant. A laugh shared with the wrong courtier, a letter intercepted, a whisper overheard, all of it could be spun into a noose. The cruelty was how public it all was. Queens were forced to stand trial before nobles who had once bowed to them, answering charges they knew were lies. They were paraded through streets on their way to execution, jeered at by crowds who feasted on their humiliation. Even their deaths were staged for maximum drama. The black-clad widow praying aloud, the trembling beauty declaring her innocence, the proud consort delivering final words with calm dignity. Every drop of blood was another page in the theater of monarchy. And still, people called it justice. Still, history often painted these women as guilty, their deaths deserved. The victors wrote the chronicles, and they never failed to justify the blade. Queens who had once been praised for beauty, charm, or piety were recast as schemers, harlots, or witches the moment they threatened to outlive their usefulness. Their fall was not tragedy, but inevitability. It didn't matter if you were guilty. It didn't matter if you were loyal, faithful, and devout. The moment you stopped serving the king's needs, whether for heirs, for alliances, or for simple pleasure, your life balanced on a knife's edge. Annulment if he wanted to humiliate you quietly, execution if he wanted to erase you loudly. Both paths ended the same way. Stripped of the crown, stripped of your dignity, reduced to an example for others. Fairy tales promise that queens lived happily ever after. The truth is that many queens didn't live at all. Not once they ceased to be valuable. They were cast aside, exiled, or slaughtered. Their names remembered less for who they were than for how they fell. Being queen didn't mean safety. It meant living every day under the shadow of dismissal or death, waiting for the moment when your king decided that the crown looked better on someone else's head. And when that moment came, there was no mercy, only the choice between a convent or a blade. Death did not free a queen from politics. It simply made her body another pawn in the game. The moment you breathed your last, your death ceased to be private, ceased to belong to your family, ceased to mean anything about your life. It became a bargaining chip, a spectacle, a stage for rival factions to posture and for kingdoms to negotiate. Queens were never allowed the dignity of simple grief, not in life, and certainly not in death. Even your funeral wasn't yours, it was theirs. The preparations began almost before your body cooled. Courtiers whispered about how to present your legacy, not whether you had been kind or wise or faithful, but whether your funeral could strengthen alliances or shore up the prestige of the crown. Which church would hold the service? Which nobles would carry the bier? Which countries must be invited to send envoys? Your corpse was a prop for negotiations, and every decision about it was calculated to reinforce the authority of the throne you no longer occupied. You had lived as a symbol, and you died as one too. The spectacle itself was grand, because it had to be. Velvet-draped coffins, incense thick enough to choke the air, choirs wailing like angels on command. But beneath the solemn chants and funereal processions, the grief was hollow. Courtiers paraded in black not because they mourned you, but because mourning you demonstrated their loyalty to the new order. Nobles bowed over your casket not out of love, but to remind everyone that they were part of the inner circle, still close to power, even if you were rotting beneath gilded wood. Your death was their costume party, and your body the centerpiece. And for the king, or the new king, if your husband had already died, your funeral was an opportunity. If you had been unpopular, it was a chance to bury the memory of your failings beneath pomp, to rewrite you in death as a saintly figure, patient and pure, erasing the rumors of ambition or disobedience that had once dogged you. If you had been beloved, it was a chance to leech your popularity, to bask in the reflected glow of a woman now safely silenced. Either way, your coffin served his image. You were useful again, if only as a prop. Even the sermons were political weapons. Priests stood at pulpits and turned your life into allegory, praising your piety or warning against your supposed sins, depending on who paid for their words. If your faction had fallen, your death might be described as a punishment from God, a warning to others not to stray. If your allies remained strong, your soul was exalted as proof of divine favor on the dynasty. No priest spoke for you. They spoke for the kingdom, for the throne, for the future. Your soul was a canvas, painted however it suited them. Your family's grief was swallowed whole by ceremony. Children were paraded in stiff gowns, forced to stand as mourners while their hearts cracked. Daughters who had barely known you were pressed forward to cry on cue. Sons who might have loved you were forced to walk tall, to prove they were strong enough to inherit. Their sorrow was not private. It was display, orchestrated for the crowd like every other part of the funeral. Even the tears of your bloodline became political capital. And when the funeral ended, when the candles burned low and the crowds dispersed, your body still wasn't allowed rest. Sometimes it was entombed with grandeur, your effigy carved in marble, hands clasped in eternal prayer. But often, queens' bodies were moved and shifted, relocated when politics demanded. You could be dug up years later, reburied in a grander cathedral to glorify a new dynasty, or hidden away in some forgotten chapel if your memory grew inconvenient. Even in death, you were not secure. Your bones were currency, traded and displayed as symbols of legitimacy. The legacy that followed you was no more merciful. You were remembered not as a woman, but as a lesson. Chroniclers wrote about your beauty, your piety, your failures, your supposed sins, never your humanity. If you had died young, you were a tragic angel. If you had spoken too boldly, you were a schemer. If you had failed to produce sons, you were cursed. Rarely did anyone remember the long hours of endurance, the quiet acts of survival, the nights spent in pain or prayer. You were not allowed to be complicated. You were a story, and the story was written to serve others. The cruelest irony was how quickly grief faded. The bells tolled, the prayers were said, the mourning gowns worn, and then life went on. The court laughed again. Feasts resumed. New alliances formed. The king remarried, sometimes within months, your place taken by another woman whose face appeared in tapestries where yours once had been. Your ladies pledged loyalty to her. Your jewels were refitted for her. Your children learned to bow to her. You vanished before you were even in the ground. Fairy tales would have us believe that queens live forever in memory, immortalized as beloved figures whose deaths inspire generations. The truth is bleaker. Most queens faded into shadows. Their funerals remembered less for mourning than for the politics surrounding them. You were useful in life only as long as you produced heirs, and useful in death only as long as your body could lend legitimacy to the next ruler. Beyond that, you were dust, scattered, and forgotten. Your death was not the end of struggle. It was just another move in the endless game of power you had played since girlhood. And like every other move, it was never yours to make. Even in your coffin, you still belonged to the crown. History pretends to remember queens, but in truth, it remembers very few. A handful of names echo through centuries, tied to scandal, tragedy, or blood. Anne Boleyn, Catherine de' Medici, Marie Antoinette, women whose stories end in spectacle. But for every queen who burned her way into the annals with drama, there were dozens more whose names slipped into dust. They were just as real, just as burdened, just as broken by the crown. Yet because they weren't scandalous enough to terrify or tragic enough to entertain, they disappeared. Forgotten queens outnumber the famous ones, but their silence is so complete, it's as though they never lived at all. You can feel their absence in the way chronicles glide over them, granting only a line, "The king took a wife." No details about her childhood, no record of her thoughts, no sense of her grief. She becomes a placeholder, a womb on paper, defined only by the number of sons she bore and the year she died. If she produced heirs, the chroniclers praised God. If she didn't, they cursed her name and moved on. Either way, She is remembered only in relation to her fertility, never for herself. It is erasure disguised as history, and yet these women existed. They walked through drafty palaces, endured childbirth in candlelit chambers, embroidered until their fingers bled, smiled when they wanted to scream. They carried the weight of entire dynasties on their backs, their bodies expected to solve political crises and secure futures. But because they did so quietly, without open scandal, without spectacular rebellion, they became invisible. History doesn't know what to do with women who endured instead of exploded, so it ignores them. The ones who linger in memory are the ones who fell dramatically. Queens who were executed, accused of witchcraft, caught in affairs, or blamed for wars. These stories endured because they were entertaining. Chroniclers loved the fall of women who seemed too bold, too beautiful, too clever. They wrote those tales with venom, sharpening the legend until it glittered with malice. Those queens are remembered, yes, but remembered for their destruction, not their survival. The rest, the ones who simply bore children and prayed and died quietly, were erased. No one sings about the silent queen, and the truth is, most queens were silent. Not because they lacked thoughts, but because their lives gave them no room to speak. Their survival depended on obedience, on vanishing into the role expected of them. A queen who never challenged her husband, who never antagonized her in-laws, who never drew attention to herself, might live long enough to see her grandchildren, but she wouldn't be remembered. Her legacy would be her children, her grandchildren, her faceless contribution to a dynasty that would never say her name again. The forgotten queens are ghosts in the margins. They are women whose portraits were painted but never labeled, whose tombs were neglected until the names wore away, whose letters were burned or lost because no one thought them important. They are wives of kings whose reigns dominate textbooks, yet their own lives are reduced to footnotes. Sometimes their stories survive only in fragments, a dowry list, a line in a tax record, a passing mention in a foreign ambassador's diary. Enough to prove they existed, but not enough to know who they were. What makes this erasure crueler is how deliberate it often was. New queens didn't want to share the stage with old ones. Chroniclers eager to flatter rulers erased inconvenient wives from their accounts, or painted them as unworthy of memory. Sometimes the church itself buried their stories, branding them sinful or cursed, leaving only silence behind. Queens who failed to leave heirs were particularly vulnerable, their memory scrubbed as though their barrenness made them unfit for history. To remember them would be to remember failure, and kingdoms never liked to admit failure. Imagine spending your entire life bound in the suffocating role of consort, obeying every rule, performing every ritual, enduring every humiliation, only to be forgotten as though you never existed. That was the fate of countless queens. They wore crowns, but crowns did not immortalize them. They were erased more thoroughly than peasants, because at least peasants were remembered in collective struggles, in the tides of famine and revolt. Forgotten queens weren't even granted that. Their lives dissolved like mist, leaving behind only the names of kings and sons. And so, when we think of queens today, we think of the extreme few, the infamous or the doomed, because those are the stories that survived. But for every Anne Boleyn who mounted a scaffold, there were 10 women who lived in silence, whose names we will never know. They are buried beneath layers of neglect, hidden behind the glittering lies of fairy tales and the harsh caricatures of infamous queens. They lived, they suffered, they died, and then they vanished, erased by the very crown that had consumed them. This is the final cruelty of queenship. Not just that it broke women in life, but that it obliterated them in death. You could endure everything: political games, childbirth, humiliation, betrayal, and still your reward was silence. Forgotten queens are the majority, and yet they are treated as though they were nothing at all. They were real, and history chose not to remember them. Every rule has its exceptions, and queenship was no different. For every nameless consort erased from history, there were a few who refused to stay silent, who clawed their way out of the suffocating role of womb with a crown and demanded to be recognized as rulers in their own right. Names like Eleanor of Aquitaine or Isabella of Castile gleam in history books as proof that queens could be powerful, cunning, and formidable. They were the rare women who bent the cage bars wide enough to step through. But to treat them as fairy tale heroines is to misunderstand the reality. Their power did not make them safe. It only made them targets. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine. In an age when women were expected to bow and embroider, she commanded armies, married and divorced kings, and shaped the politics of both France and England. She was brilliant, daring, larger than life. But her story was not one of freedom. It was one of constant survival. When she clashed with her second husband, Henry II, he locked her away for years, proof that even the fiercest queen could be caged. She lived surrounded by danger, every triumph shadowed by the risk of betrayal, every decision scrutinized by men waiting for the chance to drag her down. Her legacy looks golden now, but her life was a series of battles against those who wanted to break her. Or consider Isabella of Castile, who alongside Ferdinand of Aragon helped forge a united Spain. Chroniclers praise her as a queen who ruled like a king, decisive, shrewd, ruthless when necessary. Yet her reign was steeped in blood and peril. She walked a tightrope of alliances, wars, and conspiracies, her authority questioned at every turn simply because she was a woman. The same nobles who obeyed her did so grudgingly, muttering about the unnaturalness of female rule. Her faith in God became both shield and sword, because she knew that without religion sanctifying her authority, men would have torn it from her. Power for her was not luxury, it was constant vigilance, a throne perched above a pit of knives. Even these so-called great queens lived lives balanced on precarious ground. For every victory, there was danger. For every triumph, there was suspicion. A queen who wielded power could never afford to rest. She had to be sharper, colder, more ruthless than her male counterparts, because her very existence in the halls of power was considered an affront. If a king was cruel, he was strong. If a queen was cruel, she was monstrous. If a king plotted, he was shrewd. If a queen plotted, she was deceitful. Every action that secured their power also invited accusations that they were unnatural, dangerous, unholy. And for every Eleanor or Isabella, there were countless others who tried and failed. Women who dared to lead armies, dared to assert themselves, dared to speak out in council, only to be branded witches, adulteresses, or traitors. The difference between a great queen and a ruined one was often nothing more than timing, being born in the right place with the right allies, or surviving long enough to have history rewrite you as admirable instead of abominable. Had Eleanor died in prison, she might have been remembered as a cautionary tale rather than a legend. Had Isabella lost her wars, she might have been damned as a fanatic rather than praised as a founder. The myth of the great queen is seductive because it suggests that queenship wasn't always a trap, that women could sometimes win. And yes, some did. But even their victories were forged in hardship. They ruled through constant threat, surrounded by men who questioned their every move, undermined by rivals, hunted by gossip. Their power was real, but it was never secure. They wore crowns that might topple at any moment, and they knew it. What history forgets is the toll. To be powerful in such a world was to live with ceaseless strain, to trust no one fully, to guard every word. It meant marrying off children for political gain, watching friends turn into enemies overnight, sacrificing tenderness in the name of survival. These queens were admired because they played the game better than anyone expected them to. But the game itself was merciless. They weren't heroines in fairy tales. They were survivors in nightmares. And even after their deaths, their stories were reshaped to suit men's needs. Eleanor became the romanticized grande dame of chivalry. Isabella became the pious architect of empire. Their complexities, their compromises, their darker choices were smoothed into legend. They were remembered not as women, but as symbols. Safe, sanitized, stripped of the raw danger that had defined their lives. The very history that calls them great also erases the constant peril in which they lived. For most queens, greatness was never an option. Their fates were sealed the moment they married, their futures tethered to the whims of kings. The ones who rose above did so at terrible risk, knowing that a single mistake could end with exile, imprisonment, or execution. They dared anyway, and that daring is why their names survive. But their survival should not blind us to the truth. Even the greatest queens were never free. They were only the exceptions that proved how impossible the rule really was. You wouldn't last a day. That isn't an insult. It's a fact. The fantasy of being queen in medieval times is a trick of velvet paintings and fairy tales, a glittering illusion spun by stories that forget the blood, the filth, and the suffocating weight of that crown. You imagine silks and feasts, obedient servants and sparkling jewels. What you'd actually get is a forced marriage at 14, a body torn open by childbirth again and again, a husband parading mistresses through your palace, nobles whispering that you were a witch, and the very real possibility of imprisonment, exile, or execution when you inevitably cease to be useful. That was queenship, not majesty, not romance, survival. Your entire life was not your own. From cradle to crown, you were groomed, traded, bartered. Your father signed you away like a piece of livestock, your dowry calculated more carefully than your future happiness. Consent was a laughable concept. You didn't marry for love. You married because your body was a bargaining chip that sealed treaties and paused wars. And on your wedding day, dressed in a gown so heavy it bruised your shoulders, veiled until you could barely breathe, you were paraded as a trophy, fertility wrapped in silk. The bed that followed was worse. There was no romance, no privacy. Your first night with your new husband might be witnessed by servants, the bloody sheets displayed to prove your virginity to the court. Your partner was often older, drunk, smelly, and utterly indifferent to your terror. If he was kind, it was luck. If he was brutal, it was your duty to endure. And all of it was for one purpose: producing sons. Your worth began and ended with your womb. Miscarriages were your fault. Daughters were disappointments. Stillbirths were curses you somehow invited. Every pregnancy was a gamble with death, and the dice were loaded against you. Infection, hemorrhage, fever. At any birth, the queen could die, her body reduced to a cautionary tale whispered as the king moved on to a new bride. And when you lived, your survival came with humiliation. Your belly was public property, your fertility dissected in gossip. If you didn't produce heirs quickly enough, rumors swirled. You were barren, cursed, bewitched. If your husband cheated, and he always cheated, you swallowed the shame in silence, watching his mistresses strut through the palace while the court laughed at your expense. To protest was to risk being accused of jealousy, or worse, treason. Queens did not get the dignity of dignity. They were humiliated as entertainment. Life in the palace was no consolation. Forget cozy castles. They were drafty, smoky, vermin-infested prisons where privacy was a myth and every servant might be a spy. Your gowns were so heavy you could hardly move. You stank beneath your perfume, lice nesting in the velvet folds of your crown. Your meals were feasts for rats, spoiled meat disguised under spices, poisoned cups never far from your lips. The very walls that glittered in candlelight were cold cages, filled with rivals, frenemies, and backstabbers who sharpened their gossip like daggers. And if you somehow survived the politics of daily life, the dangers only multiplied with age. If your husband was weak, you quietly cleaned up his messes, knowing that if he fell, you would fall with him. If you were too clever, too visible, too powerful, you risked being branded a witch or a femme fatale, accused of manipulating the king with dark charms. If you outlived your husband, widowhood was not freedom but captivity, your fate handed to the next king, whether he was your son, your brother-in-law, or a man who saw you as a relic to be exiled. And if you were unlucky enough to lose your place entirely, the outcome was simple: imprisonment in a cold tower, a starvation diet, or a neatly staged execution where the crowd jeered as your head rolled into straw. Queenship didn't guarantee survival. It guaranteed risk. Even in death, you weren't allowed peace. Your funeral wasn't about your life, but about politics. Priests used your corpse to preach obedience. Nobles used your bier as a stage to flaunt loyalty. Your jewels were stripped for the next queen. Your children, if they survived, were paraded as props in your memory. You weren't mourned. You were used one last time. And then, unless you had been scandalous or spectacularly tragic, you were forgotten. Your name scraped out of chronicles, your story erased, your existence reduced to a line in a genealogy chart. Now compare that to your life today. You sleep in a bed with clean sheets, not a straw mattress crawling with fleas. You drink water from a tap without worrying about cholera. You choose if, when, and whom you marry, not because your father signed your future away with ink and a handshake. You can survive childbirth without gambling your life on the mercy of luck and prayer. You have heating, showers, Netflix, deodorant, privacy, and autonomy. Luxuries that would have seemed like witchcraft themselves to any queen who ever lived. So the next time you glance at a glittering crown in a museum or sigh over a royal drama on television, remind yourself of the truth. Queens didn't live lives of ease and luxury. They lived lives of constant danger, humiliation, and suffering, their crowns heavier than any iron shackle. They were prisoners in silk, pawns in gold, symbols dressed in jewels but stripped of humanity. And the crown, coveted and gleaming, almost always came with a coffin,